Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. My name is Brianna Yates, and for 11 years I worked as a law enforcement ranger in the William B. Bankhead National Forest in northwestern Alabama. I've told this story exactly twice before. Once to the internal affairs investigator who reviewed the incident report. Once to my therapist, 6 months after I took early retirement. Both times I left things out. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because some details don't translate well into official language. Some experiences resist the neat categories of incident reports and psychological evaluations. This is the first time I'm telling it complete. The Bankhead covers over 180,000 acres of the Cumberland Plateau, a landscape of sandstone canyons, hardwood forests, and longleaf pine stands that stretch toward the Tennessee border. It's one of the most biodiverse places east of the Mississippi. It's also one of the most disorienting. The terrain folds in on itself, ridges and hollows creating a maze of similar-looking forest that can turn experienced hikers around in minutes. We lose people there every year. Most of them we find. Some of them we don't. I worked the night shift for most of my career. That wasn't by choice. Not initially. When I started, nights were what they gave to the new rangers, the ones who hadn't earned the daylight hours yet. But after a few years, I found I preferred it. There's a different kind of awareness that comes with working in darkness. Your other senses sharpen. You learn to read the forest by sound and smell, and the quality of the air against your skin. You learn to trust instincts you didn't know you had. Marcus Crowell was my partner for the last 4 years of my time at Bankhead. He'd been with the Forest Service for over 2 decades, most of it spent in various parks across the southeast. He was the kind of ranger who could identify a bird by the pattern of its wing beats, who could tell you what animals had passed through an area just by the way the undergrowth was disturbed. I learned more from him in those 4 years than I had in the previous 7 combined. What happened to us occurred in late September, during the transition from summer to fall when the nights start carrying that first edge of cold, but the days still hold the memory of August heat. The forest was in flux, the deciduous trees just beginning to consider changing color, the summer insects giving way to the quieter sounds of autumn. It's a strange time in the woods. A threshold time. The kind of time when things can slip through. We were running a routine night patrol along the eastern boundary of the forest, an area that had seen some illegal dumping activity in recent months. Someone had been using the old logging roads to dispose of construction debris and household waste, and our job was to catch them in the act, or at least gather enough evidence to identify the perpetrators. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. People don't realize how much damage illegal dumping can do to a forest ecosystem. The chemicals leach into the groundwater. The debris creates hazards for wildlife. And once word gets out that an area is being used as a dump site, it attracts more dumping. A cascade of neglect that can take years to reverse. We'd been out for about 3 hours, working our way along a network of unpaved roads that wound through the pine stands, when Marcus pulled the truck to a stop. I looked over at him. His face was lit from below by the glow of the dashboard instruments, casting strange shadows across his features. He was staring straight ahead, but his attention was elsewhere, listening. "You hear that?" he asked. I rolled down my window and listened. At first, all I could hear was the engine idling, the soft tick of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through the pine needles overhead. The usual night sounds of the forest. Crickets, the distant call of a barred owl, the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. Then I heard it. A thin, high sound, almost like a voice. almost like someone calling out from very far away. It rose and fell in a pattern that seemed deliberate, purposeful, not a random noise, not the wind playing tricks through the trees, something more structured, more intentional. "What is that?" I asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence made the sound clearer. It was coming from somewhere to the north, deeper in the forest, maybe half a mile away. Maybe more. Distance is hard to judge at night, especially in terrain like this where sound bounces off ridges and gets swallowed by hollows. "Sounds almost human," I said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "Almost," he agreed. "But listen to the rhythm." I listened, the sound came again, that thin, high call, and then again, and then again. And I realized what he meant. There was a pattern to it, a regularity. It rose and fell at precise intervals like breathing, like something inhaling and exhaling, like a machine cycling through its operation. "Not human," Marcus said. "Humans don't breathe that evenly, not when they're calling out, not when they're in distress. There'd be variation, breaks, changes in pitch. This is too regular, too mechanical. So what is it?" He was quiet for a long moment. The sound continued, that thin, high pulse rising and falling against the darkness. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I don't like it. We should check it out," I said. Marcus looked at me. In the dim light, I couldn't quite read his expression, but I could sense his hesitation. "Yeah," he said, "I guess we should." He reached for the radio and called in our position, letting dispatch know we were investigating an unusual sound in the forest and would check back in 30 minutes. Standard protocol. Then he grabbed his flashlight from the center console and I grabbed mine from the door pocket, and we stepped out into the night. The forest closed around us immediately. The truck's headlights cut 2 bright tunnels through the darkness, but beyond their reach, everything was shadow. The pines rose around us like columns in a vast dark church, their trunks barely visible, their canopies merging into a black ceiling overhead. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of pine resin and decaying leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the thin, high sound continued its rhythmic pulse. We started walking. The terrain sloped gently downward as we moved away from the road, the ground soft with generations of fallen needles. Marcus led the way, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the forest floor, picking out roots and rocks and the occasional glint of animal eyes watching from the underbrush. I followed a few paces behind. My own light pointed slightly to the side to expand our field of vision. We didn't talk. There was no need. We'd worked together long enough to communicate through gesture and movement, through the angle of a flashlight beam or the pace of footsteps. And besides, talking would have made it harder to track the sound. It was strange how the sound seemed to stay the same distance away no matter how far we walked. That thin, high call, rising and falling with mechanical precision, always ahead of us, always just out of reach. I found myself counting the intervals between pulses. 8 seconds, always 8 seconds. Rise, fall, silence. Rise, fall, silence. Like the breathing of something very large, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, Marcus stopped. He held up a hand, and I stopped too, my flashlight beam freezing on the ground in front of me. The sound had changed. It was still there, still that thin, high pulse. But now there was something underneath it, a lower frequency, a vibration more than a sound. I could feel it in my chest, in the bones of my face. It was like standing too close to a subwoofer, that deep bass note that you experience more than hear. "What is that?" I whispered. Marcus shook his head. His face had gone very still, the way it did when he was processing something he didn't understand. The forest around us had gone quiet too. I realized suddenly that I could no longer hear the crickets, the owls, the small rustlings of nocturnal life. Just the thin, high sound and that underlying pulse, that subsonic vibration that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We should go back," Marcus said. It was so unexpected that for a moment I didn't respond. In 4 years of working together, I'd never heard him suggest retreat. Not once. He was the one who pushed deeper, stayed longer, followed trails that anyone else would have abandoned. "What? Something's wrong here," he said. "I don't know what, but something's wrong. We should go back to the truck and call this in. Get more people out here in daylight." "We're already here," I said. "We're probably close to the source. Let's just see what it is." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked back toward the sound, toward that invisible source somewhere in the darkness ahead of us. His jaw tightened. "Fine," he said. "But we stay close, and if I say we leave, we leave. No arguments." I agreed. We started walking again. The forest grew denser as we moved deeper into the hollow. The pines gave way to a mixed growth of oak and hickory, the understory thickening with mountain laurel and rhododendron until we were pushing through foliage rather than walking freely. The ground became rougher, broken by sandstone outcrops and the channels of seasonal streams. Twice, I stumbled on hidden rocks. Once, I walked face first into a spider web that seemed to cover an entire gap between trees, and I had to stop to clear the sticky threads from my eyes and mouth. And still the sound continued. That thin, high pulse, that rhythmic breathing, always 8 seconds, always ahead of us, always just out of reach. Then Marcus stopped again, so suddenly that I almost walked into his back. "Brianna," he said. His voice had changed. There was something in it I'd never heard before. Something that might have been fear. "Look." I stepped up beside him and looked where his flashlight was pointing. There was a path. Not a trail, not an official Forest Service route, but a narrow track worn through the underbrush by the passage of feet. It couldn't have been more than 18 inches wide, barely visible even in the beam of our flashlights, but it was unmistakably a path. Someone had walked this way many times. Someone had created this route through the dense vegetation, this thin thread of bare earth cutting through the forest. The path led directly toward the sound. "Marcus," I started. "I see it," he said. "I see it." We stood there for a moment, our flashlights trained on that narrow track, listening to the thin, high sound pulse and pulse and pulse from somewhere ahead. The path disappeared into the darkness after maybe 20 feet, swallowed by the vegetation, but I could sense its continuation, could feel it drawing me forward. "This isn't random," Marcus said. "Someone comes here, regularly. To do what?" That was the question. That was the question I couldn't stop asking myself as we stepped onto the path and began to follow it deeper into the hollow. The sound was louder now, clearer, and I could almost make out details in it. Not words exactly, but something like words. Something like a voice trying to communicate through a medium that couldn't quite carry language. The path wound through the vegetation, following the contours of the land, avoiding the worst of the rocks and roots with the efficiency of long use. Whoever had made this trail knew the terrain, knew it intimately, knew the best way to move through this dense growth without leaving obvious signs of passage. We walked for maybe another 10 minutes. The sound grew louder. The subsonic vibration grew stronger, until I could feel it in my teeth, in the fluid of my eyes. The forest around us had gone completely silent now. No insects, no birds, no rustling of small animals. Just our footsteps and our breathing and that thin, high pulse that seemed to fill the air like smoke. Then the path ended. It didn't fade away gradually. It didn't merge into another trail or open onto a clearing. It simply stopped, the worn track giving way to a dense thicket of mountain laurel that formed an impenetrable wall of dark, glossy leaves. But that wasn't what made us stop. What made us stop was the tape. Yellow plastic tape, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, had been strung across the entrance to the thicket. It was wrapped around tree trunks and threaded through branches, forming a barrier that was clearly meant to keep people out. Or maybe to keep something in. And on the tape, written in black marker in letters large enough to read from 6 feet away, was a single word: listen. No, that wasn't right. I looked again, my flashlight beam trembling slightly as it played across the yellow plastic. Don't listen. Marcus and I stood there for a long moment, our flashlights trained on that yellow tape, on those two words written in hasty black marker. The thin, high sound continued from somewhere beyond the thicket, that rhythmic pulse that rose and fell with mechanical precision, that breathing that wasn't breathing, that voice that wasn't quite a voice. Don't listen. Who wrote this? I asked. My voice came out rough, thick, like I hadn't used it in hours. Marcus didn't answer. He was staring at the tape, at the words, at the dark wall of vegetation beyond. His face had gone very pale in the beam of my flashlight, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd ever seen them. The sound changed again. It was subtle at first. The rhythm stayed the same. That 8-second cycle, that rise and fall. But the pitch shifted, higher, more urgent. And there was something new underneath it, something that might have been another voice, another source, layering over the first in a kind of dissonant harmony. "Brianna," Marcus said, "we need to leave, right now." I knew he was right. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to walk back to the truck, to radio for backup and let someone else deal with whatever was on the other side of that yellow tape. But something held me in place. Some need to understand. Some compulsion to see this through to its source. "We're already here," I said. "We need to know what this is." "No," Marcus said. His voice was firm now, the uncertainty gone. We don't need to know. Some things you're better off not knowing. Some things you can't unknow once you know them." He reached for my arm, and I let him take it. Let him start to pull me back, away from the tape, away from the sound, back toward the path we'd followed to get here. And that's when the sound stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like a physical blow. One moment that thin, high pulse was filling the air around us, and the next there was nothing. Just our breathing. Just the blood rushing in our ears. Just the vast, crushing weight of the forest's silence. We stood frozen, our flashlights still pointed at the yellow tape. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The forest had become a vacuum, a void, an absence of everything that normally gave it life. Then, from somewhere in the thicket, we heard a new sound. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving through the dense vegetation with the ease of long familiarity, coming closer. "Run," Marcus said. We ran. I don't remember the path. I don't remember navigating the terrain, avoiding the rocks and roots that had tripped me on the way in. I just remember running, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Marcus was ahead of me, moving faster than I would have thought possible for a man his age, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. I followed the bobbing light, crashed through vegetation that tore at my uniform and scratched my face, stumbled and caught myself and kept running. The footsteps followed. They were behind us now, behind and to the left. Moving through the forest with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, that couldn't have been possible through that dense undergrowth. I could hear branches breaking, leaves rustling, the steady rhythm of feet striking ground. 8-second intervals. Rise, fall, silence. Rise, fall, silence. The same pattern as the sound. The same mechanical precision. The pines appeared around us, the vegetation thinning as we climbed out of the hollow. I could see the sky now, stars visible through gaps in the canopy, and I ran toward them like they were a promise of safety. Like the darkness above was somehow better than the darkness behind. We burst out onto the logging road maybe 50 yards from where we'd parked. The truck was there, exactly where we'd left it, its headlights still cutting bright tunnels through the night. Marcus reached it first, yanked open the driver's door, threw himself inside. I was right behind him, slamming into the passenger side, pulling the door shut with the hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Marcus started the engine. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the packed earth before catching traction. We accelerated down the logging road, away from the forest, away from the hollow, away from whatever had been following us through the trees. I looked in the side mirror as we drove. The road behind us was empty. The forest stood dark and silent, revealing nothing. But I could still feel those footsteps, could still hear that rhythm, that 8-second pulse, that breathing that wasn't breathing. We didn't speak until we were back on the paved road, heading toward the ranger station. Marcus's hands were white on the steering wheel. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. "What was that?" I finally asked. He shook his head. "I don't know." "Someone was back there, following us." "I know. The tape, the warning. Someone knew about that sound. Someone was trying to keep people away." "I know," Marcus said again. His voice was flat, exhausted. "I know. We have to report this." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "we do. The incident report took 3 hours to write. We sat in the ranger station, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, cups of cold coffee growing colder on the desk between us. I wrote. Marcus paced. Neither of us could sit still for long. The problem was that nothing we'd experienced fit neatly into the categories the Forest Service used. There was no crime to report, not exactly. No injury, no property damage. We'd heard a strange sound in the forest and found some yellow tape with a warning written on it. That was all. Reduced to those terms, it sounded like nothing, like a waste of time. But it wasn't nothing. We both knew it wasn't nothing. Something was happening in that hollow. Someone had created that path, strung that tape, written that warning. Someone knew what was out there and was trying to keep people away from it. Or toward it. The warning had said, "Don't listen." But we'd been listening. We'd followed the sound for over half a mile into the forest. And then we'd run. And something had followed us. The morning shift arrived at 6. Marcus and I handed off the incident report, explained what we'd found in the vaguest terms possible, and went home. I don't remember driving. I don't remember unlocking my apartment door or feeding my cat or taking off my boots. I just remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Except it wasn't silent. Not really. There was always sound, even in the quietest room. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the distant rumble of traffic on the highway, all the white noise of modern life that we learned to tune out, to ignore, to not hear even when it's there. I couldn't tune it out anymore. I could hear everything. Every creak of the building settling, every rustle of my cat moving through the apartment, every beat of my own heart, steady and rhythmic, 8 seconds between each pulse. 8 seconds. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. My heart wasn't beating every 8 seconds. That would be pathologically slow, barely 7 beats per minute. A heart rate that low would mean I was dying, but I could hear it. That rhythm, that pulse. Rise, fall, silence, rise, fall, silence. It was in my head. I got out of bed, walked to the window, pulled back the curtain, and looked out at the parking lot of my apartment complex. The rows of cars shimmering in the early morning heat. The trees at the edge of the property swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel through the glass. The sound was still there. That thin, high pulse. That breathing that wasn't breathing. It was faint now, almost imperceptible, but it was there, playing on a loop in my mind like a song I couldn't forget. Don't listen. But how do you stop listening once you've started? How do you unhear something that's already inside you? I didn't sleep that day. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that yellow tape, those black letters, that wall of dark vegetation with something behind it, something that had followed us through the forest, something that was still following in a way I couldn't quite understand. That evening, I called Marcus. "You hear it too," I said. It wasn't a question. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then, Yeah, I hear it. What do we do?" Another silence. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I think we need to go back." I knew he was right. I'd known it since we left, since we ran from that hollow with something chasing us through the trees. The sound wasn't going to stop. The loop wasn't going to break. Not until we understood what it was. Not until we faced whatever we'd been running from. "Tomorrow night," I said. "Same time, same place." Marcus agreed. We hung up. I spent the next 24 hours in a kind of fugue state, going through the motions of my life while the sound played endlessly in my head. I ate food I couldn't taste. I watched television I couldn't focus on. I spoke to neighbors and coworkers and heard my own voice as if from very far away, words coming out of my mouth that seemed to have nothing to do with me. The sound was changing, growing more complex. I could hear layers in it now, harmonies and counter-melodies that hadn't been there before. It was like a piece of music that revealed new depths the more you listened to it. Like a puzzle that got harder the more pieces you found. Don't listen. But I couldn't stop. We met at the same logging road, at the same time of night. The forest was different now, or maybe I was different. The darkness seemed deeper, the shadows more pronounced. The pines rose around us like watchers, silent and patient, waiting to see what we would do. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn, his movements slightly uncoordinated. But there was a determination in him that I recognized. The same determination that had kept him in the Forest Service for 20 years. The same stubbornness that made him the best ranger I'd ever worked with. "You still hear it?" he asked. I nodded. "All day, all night. It won't stop." "Me neither," he said. "I tried everything. White noise, loud music, earplugs. Nothing works. It's like it's inside my head now, like it's part of me." We started walking. The path was easier to find this time. Or maybe we just knew where to look. We pushed into the forest, following the route we'd taken 2 nights before, moving through the pines and into the mixed hardwoods, down into the hollow where the vegetation grew dense and the darkness grew absolute. The sound was louder here, clearer. It wasn't just in our heads anymore. It was in the air around us, vibrating in the leaves, resonating in the sandstone outcrops. That thin, high pulse, that rhythmic breathing. 8 seconds. Always 8 seconds. But there was something else now. A second sound, underneath the first. Lower. More complex. Almost like words, but not quite. Almost like language, but in a grammar I couldn't parse. The tape was still there when we reached the end of the path. Yellow plastic, wrapped around branches, blocking the entrance to the thicket. The words were still visible in the beam of our flashlights. "Don't listen." Marcus reached out and tore the tape down. It came away easily, the plastic old and brittle, crumbling in his hands. Behind it, the thicket opened into a narrow gap, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The sound poured out of that gap like water from a burst pipe, so loud now that I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, in the fluid of my eyes. We pushed through. The thicket was maybe 10 feet deep, dense and dark and scratching at our clothes and skin. Then it opened into a clearing. I don't know what I expected to find. A cult gathering, an illegal operation, some kind of machine generating that impossible sound. But what we found was none of those things. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded on all sides by dense vegetation. In the center was a fire pit, long, cold, the ashes scattered by wind and rain. Around the fire pit were camping supplies. A tent, collapsed and mildewed. Sleeping bags, torn and rotting. Coolers filled with rainwater and dead insects. Food containers, their contents long since decayed. Someone had camped here. Someone had lived here, for days or weeks or months. And then they had left. Or they had been unable to leave. The sound was everywhere now. It filled the clearing, vibrating off every surface, creating standing waves that made my vision blur. And I realized, finally, what it was. Not a machine, not a voice, not anything alive or mechanical or produced by any source I could identify. It was the forest itself, the trees, the rocks, the air, the ground beneath our feet. Everything was vibrating at the same frequency, resonating with the same rhythm, producing that thin, high pulse that had drawn us here, that had lodged in our heads, that had refused to let us go. Marcus was standing very still in the center of the clearing, his flashlight hanging at his side. His face was slack, his eyes unfocused. He was listening, really listening, in a way that went beyond sound, beyond hearing, beyond any sense I had a name for. "Marcus," I said, but my voice came out strange, distorted by the vibration in the air. "Marcus, we need to go." He didn't respond. I walked toward him, reached for his arm. And that's when I saw the journal. It was lying on the ground near the collapsed tent, half buried in dead leaves. A cheap, spiral-bound notebook, its cover water-stained and warped. I picked it up, opened it, began to read. The handwriting was small and cramped, difficult to decipher in the wavering light of my flashlight. But I made out enough. September 3rd. Arrived at the site. Set up camp. Sound is fainter here, but still audible. We'll begin observations tomorrow. September 5th. Sound is louder at night. Seems to come from the northeast. Spent 6 hours trying to locate the source. Unsuccessful. September 8th. The rhythm is consistent. Approximately 8 seconds between peaks. Like breathing. Like a heartbeat. Can't identify the source. September 12th. I can hear it even when I'm not in the forest. In town. In my car. In my apartment. It's in my head now. I don't know how to make it stop. September 15th. Going back to the site. I have to understand. I have to know what it is. If I don't figure this out, I think I'll go insane. September 18th. I understand now. That was the last entry. The remaining pages were blank. I looked at the date on the last entry. September 18th. We were on September 27th. 9 days ago. Whoever had written this had been here 9 days ago, had claimed to understand something about the sound, and then had stopped writing. Had stopped everything. I looked around the clearing with new eyes. The abandoned campsite. The collapsed tent. The rotting supplies. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was where someone had been living for weeks, while they tried to understand the sound that was now embedded in my own head. And then they had understood, and then they had disappeared. "Marcus," I said again. My voice was steadier now, more urgent. "We need to leave, right now." He turned to look at me. His eyes were strange, empty, like he was looking at me from very far away, from the other side of some vast distance I couldn't comprehend. "I can hear it," he said. His voice was flat, effectless. "I can hear what it's saying." "It's not saying anything," I told him. "It's just a sound, just a frequency. It doesn't mean anything." But I wasn't sure I believed that anymore, because I could hear it too, that layer underneath the pulse, that almost language, that proto-speech, that pattern that was too complex to be random and too strange to be words. It was trying to tell us something. The forest, the trees, the rocks and soil and air, all of it was vibrating with a message, a communication, a desperate attempt to make itself understood by creatures who had never learned to listen. Don't listen. But we had listened. We were listening now, and we couldn't stop. I don't know how long we stood there. Time had become slippery, elastic, bending under the pressure of that constant sound. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The forest breathed around us, that rhythmic pulse rising and falling, and I breathed with it, my own lungs sinking to its rhythm, my own heart slowing to match its pace. Marcus had sat down at some point. He was sitting next to the cold fire pit, his head in his hands, rocking slightly back and forth. I could hear him muttering something under his breath. Words I couldn't quite make out, a counter rhythm to the forest's pulse. I made myself move, made myself walk toward him, made myself reach down and grip his shoulder, hard enough to leave bruises. "We're leaving," I said, "now." He looked up at me. There were tears on his face, but his expression was calm, almost peaceful. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not trying to hurt us. It's trying to show us something." "Show us what?" He gestured at the clearing, at the forest, at the world. "Everything," he said. "It's all connected, all of it. Every tree, every rock, every creature. All vibrating at the same frequency. All part of the same thing. We just couldn't hear it before. We'd forgotten how to listen." I pulled him to his feet. He came willingly, unresisting, like a sleepwalker being led back to bed. His eyes were still strange, still distant, but there was something coming back into them now. Something like awareness. Something like fear. "Oh God," he said, his voice cracked. "Oh God, what's happening to me?" "We're getting out of here," I said. "We're going to get out of this forest and we're never coming back." We pushed through the thicket. The sound followed us, that thin, high pulse, that rhythmic breathing. But it was fainter now, receding as we moved away from the clearing. Or maybe we were just learning to tune it out. Learning to not hear it the way we'd learned to not hear all the other sounds of modern life. The path was still there, that narrow track worn through the undergrowth. We followed it, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was silent around us. No insects, no birds, no rustle of small animals, just us, and the sound and the darkness. We were almost to the pines when I saw the tape. New tape, yellow plastic, fresh and clean, strung across the path we'd been following. It hadn't been there before. Someone had put it up in the 2 nights since we'd last come this way. I stopped walking. Marcus stopped beside me. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see the words written on the tape. "Don't listen." And underneath, in smaller letters, "They already hear you." I felt the blood drain from my face, felt my heart rate spike, breaking free of that 8-second rhythm, racing now with pure animal fear. Someone else knew about this. Someone else had been here, had heard the sound, had tried to warn people away. And they knew something we didn't. They knew that the sound wasn't just listening to the forest. The forest was listening to us. I grabbed Marcus's arm and ran. We crashed through the vegetation, abandoning the path, heading straight for where I thought the road should be. Branches tore at my clothes, at my face. I tripped over roots and rocks, fell hard, got up and kept running. Behind me, I could hear Marcus crashing through the underbrush, his breathing harsh and ragged. The trees thinned. The pines appeared around us. I could see stars overhead, could smell the logging road's packed earth and motor oil. We burst onto the road. The truck was there, exactly where we'd left it. I fumbled for my keys, dropped them, picked them up with the hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Got the door open. Got inside. Started the engine. The forest stood dark and silent behind us as we drove away. But I knew, even then, that it wasn't over. The sound was still there, playing in my head. That thin, high pulse, that rhythmic breathing. Fainter now, but still present, still waiting. Don't listen. But we had listened. We'd heard it, really heard it. And now it had heard us too. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. That thin, high pulse, that rhythmic breathing. It was quieter now, background noise rather than foreground. But it was always there, always present, a constant reminder of what we'd experienced, of what we'd failed to understand. Marcus took a leave of absence. I heard through the grapevine that he'd checked himself into a psychiatric facility in Birmingham, claiming to hear sounds that weren't there. Auditory hallucinations, they called it. A symptom of stress, of burnout, of the psychological toll that years in law enforcement can take on a person. I didn't tell anyone what I was experiencing. I just kept working, kept going through the motions, kept pretending that everything was normal, that I wasn't hearing a sound that no one else could hear, that the forest hadn't somehow gotten inside my head and taken up residence. But I couldn't go back to nights. I requested a transfer to day shifts, citing personal reasons. My supervisor approved it without much pushback. I think he could tell something was wrong, could see it in my face, in my movements, in the way I flinched at unexpected sounds. The days were easier. Sunlight made the sound fainter, less insistent. I could almost forget it during the bright hours, could almost convince myself that it had been a hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by stress and darkness and the power of suggestion. But at night it came back, every night. That thin, high pulse, that rhythmic breathing. 8 seconds, always 8 seconds. I started researching. In my off hours, in the early morning before work, and the late evening after, I dug through old incident reports, through folklore archives, through every scrap of information I could find about the Bankhead Forest and the strange things that had happened there. What I found disturbed me. The reports went back decades. Hikers who'd gone missing in the eastern section of the forest, never to be found. Rangers who'd reported hearing unusual sounds at night, sounds they couldn't identify or explain. A logging crew in the 1970s that had refused to work in a particular hollow, claiming the trees there made noises that sounded almost human. And then there were the tapes, yellow plastic tape strung across trails and paths throughout the eastern forest. "Don't listen," the tape said. "Stay away. Turn back." Dozens of reports spanning years, all describing the same thing. Someone had been putting up those warnings for a long time. Someone had known about the sound. I found a name buried in one of the older reports, a volunteer who'd worked in the forest in the 1990s, who'd claimed to have heard something strange in the eastern hollows, who'd been discharged after what his supervisors called a psychological breakdown. His name was Thomas Greeley, and according to the internet, he was still alive, living in a nursing home in Huntsville, 3 hours north of the forest. I drove there on my day off. He was old, 91 years old, confined to a wheelchair, his body failing even as his mind remained sharp. But when I mentioned the sound, when I asked him about the eastern hollows, about the yellow tape, about the words "don't listen," his eyes went wide. "You heard it," he said. It wasn't a question. I told him I had. I told him everything. The sound, the clearing, the journal, the warning on the tape, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, of being heard. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I heard it in 1993, he said. Spent 3 weeks trying to find the source. Never did. But I learned something. I learned that the sound isn't coming from somewhere. It's coming from everywhere. The whole forest. The trees, the rocks, the ground. All of it. All vibrating at the same frequency. All communicating." Communicating what? He shook his head. "I don't know. I never figured that out. But I know it's been going on for a long time. Maybe forever. The forest has a voice and it's trying to speak to us. Has been trying for centuries. We just forgot how to listen, how to understand. So why the warnings? Why tell people not to listen? Because listening changes you," he said. His eyes were distant now, looking at something I couldn't see. Once you really hear it, once you understand it, you can't go back. You can't un-hear it. You can't un-know it. And some people can't handle that. They get lost in it. They go looking for the source and they never come back. Like the person who wrote the journal I found. He nodded slowly. Like many people, over the years. The forest calls to them and they go, and they don't come back. Or they come back changed, different. Not quite themselves anymore. "What happens to them? I don't know," he said. "No one knows. That's the mystery. That's the thing I spent 30 years trying to understand. Where do they go? What do they become? What does the forest do with the people who finally learn to listen?" He looked at me then, his eyes sharp and clear. "Do you still hear it?" I admitted that I did. Every night. Quieter now, but still there. "It'll fade," he said. "Eventually, if you stay away from the forest, if you don't go back. It'll fade until it's just a memory, just a dream you can't quite remember. But it never goes away completely. It's part of you now, part of how you hear the world." He leaned forward in his wheelchair. "But don't go back," he said. "Don't try to find the source. Don't try to understand. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left closed." I drove back to Alabama that night. The forest was there, off to the west of the highway, a dark mass of trees stretching toward the horizon. I could feel it, could sense it watching me, listening to me, waiting to see what I would do. I kept driving. My name is Logan Perry, and I spent 19 years working for the Alabama Forestry Commission before a series of events convinced me that some jobs aren't worth the toll they take on your mind. This is the story of the last one, the one that ended my career, the one I still dream about on nights when the rain comes down heavy and the world outside my window turns to mud. I want you to understand something before I begin. I'm not a superstitious man. Never have been. I grew up in rural Alabama, spent my childhood hunting and fishing and camping in woods that most city folks would find terrifying. and I never once believed in ghosts or monsters, or things that go bump in the night. The forest was just the forest to me. Trees and dirt and animals doing what animals do. Nothing mysterious about it. Nothing that couldn't be explained by biology and weather and the simple mechanics of the natural world. That's what I believed for most of my life. That's what I want to go back to believing, if I'm being honest. But I can't. Not after Tower 7. Fire lookout towers are relics of another era. Most of them have been decommissioned, replaced by satellite imaging and aircraft patrols and all the other technological advances that have made human eyes on the horizon seem quaint, unnecessary, obsolete. There was a time when these towers dotted the landscape of every major forest in America, staffed by men and women who would spend weeks at a time alone, watching for smoke, calling in reports, serving as the first line of defense against wildfires that could consume thousands of acres if left unchecked. But in certain parts of the country, in certain forests where the terrain is too rough and the canopy too dense for modern detection methods, the old towers still stand, still serve their purpose, still require someone to climb those narrow stairs and sit alone for hours, watching the horizon for the first faint plume of smoke that might signal disaster. Tower 7 was one of those relics. It stood on a ridge in the Conecuh National Forest, about 40 feet tall, its wooden frame weathered by decades of Alabama summers and winters. The paint that had once protected it had long since flaked away, leaving the bare wood exposed to the elements, graying and splitting under the assault of sun and rain. The windows at the top were smeared with grime that no amount of cleaning could fully remove, the accumulated residue of countless storms and the slow drift of forest debris. The stairs creaked and swayed in high winds, each step a negotiation between the climber and gravity. The whole structure had a quality of impermanence about it, like it might collapse at any moment, like it was held together by nothing more than habit and stubbornness and the reluctance of old things to finally let go. I'd been up there maybe half a dozen times in my career. It wasn't part of my regular duties, but sometimes circumstances required it. Equipment checks, relief shifts when the usual lookout was sick or on leave, the occasional welfare check when someone up there stopped responding to radio calls. That's what brought me to Tower 7 on the night of October 14th. A welfare check. Wade Barlow was my partner that night. He'd been with the commission even longer than I had. 23 years of service that had left their mark on his face and his hands and his slow, deliberate way of moving. He was a quiet man, Wade. The kind of quiet that came from having seen enough that words seemed insufficient, unnecessary, almost wasteful. His face was weathered like old leather, creased by sun and wind, and the particular strain of spending decades outdoors in a climate that didn't forgive carelessness. We'd worked together on and off for years, one of those partnerships that develops its own rhythm, its own shorthand, its own comfortable silences. The call came in around 8 p.m. Tower 7 had missed its regular check-in. The lookout stationed there, a seasonal worker named Dennis Kowalski, hadn't responded to radio hails for the past 3 hours. That wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. Radio equipment failed sometimes. Batteries died. People fell asleep after long hours of staring at unchanging horizons. But protocol required us to verify that everything was okay. So, Wade and I loaded into the truck and headed out. I remember the weight of the evening air as we climbed into the cab. October in Alabama carries a particular quality, a heaviness that speaks of summer's reluctant departure and winter's patient approach. The heat of the day had faded, but the humidity remained, clinging to everything, making the air feel thick and substantial in a way that northern folks never quite understand. The drive took about 45 minutes. The first 30 were on paved roads, winding through small towns that had mostly shut down for the night, past gas stations and dollar stores and churches with their parking lots empty and their signs announcing Sunday services. Then the pavement ended, and we turned onto the forest roads, those narrow arteries that wound through the trees like veins through living tissue. The last 15 minutes were on unpaved roads that wound through the forest like arteries, narrow and twisting and hemmed in by walls of longleaf pine. The headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the pale trunks of trees that seemed to press closer with every mile. No other vehicles. No signs of human presence. Just the forest, endless and patient, swallowing the light as quickly as we could produce it. It had rained earlier that day. Not a heavy rain, but enough to soften the ground, to turn the packed earth of the forest roads into something more yielding. I could feel the truck's tires slipping occasionally on the muddy surface, could hear the wet sound of rubber struggling for purchase. Wade adjusted the wheel to compensate, his movements automatic, born of decades of driving these roads in every conceivable condition. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't much to say. We'd done this kind of thing before, these welfare checks, these late-night drives into the deep forest to verify that someone was still alive and functioning. Most of the time it turned out to be nothing. A dead radio battery, a lookout who'd fallen asleep, a simple miscommunication about check-in times. Most of the time. The road ended at a small clearing at the base of the ridge where Tower 7 stood. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, just large enough to turn a vehicle around, its edges defined by the dark wall of forest that surrounded it on all sides. A single-track trail led up from there, too narrow for vehicles, winding through the trees toward the tower's base. We parked, and the silence that followed the engine's death was immediate and absolute. No insects, no night birds, no rustle of animals in the underbrush. Just stillness, heavy and complete. Wade and I exchanged a glance. We'd both noticed it. The forest shouldn't have been this quiet. Even at night, especially at night, there should have been sound. Owls hunting, crickets singing. The 1,000 small noises that make up the symphony of a living forest. But there was nothing. Just silence, pressing in from all sides like something physical. We grabbed our flashlights and radios and started walking. The trail was steep. My calves burned within the first 5 minutes, the incline demanding more than I'd expected. The day's rain had made the path slick, and I had to watch my footing carefully, placing each step with deliberation. I could hear Wade breathing hard behind me, the sound loud in the unnatural quiet. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so dense that our flashlight beams seemed to stop just a few feet ahead, unable to penetrate the darkness beyond. The air was thick with moisture, heavy with the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. That smell is something I've never been able to forget. The particular combination of rotting vegetation and rain-soaked earth and pine resin that I now associate with fear. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, its voice muffled and strange, as if coming from underwater. It was the only sound I heard on that climb, the only indication that anything in this forest was still alive. We climbed for maybe 15 minutes before the trees began to thin and the slope began to level out. The tower came into view gradually. First, its skeletal frame visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, then its details resolving as we drew closer. The observation platform at the top. The narrow stairs spiraling up around the central column. The small cabin perched at the summit, its windows dark. In daylight, Tower 7 was merely old, merely weathered, merely a structure past its prime. But at night, with the forest pressing in around it and the silence weighing on everything, it looked different. It looked like something that had been forgotten, Something that had been left behind when everything else had moved on. Something that had been waiting, alone in the darkness, for someone to finally come. Wade stopped walking. I stopped beside him. "Look," he said. He was pointing his flashlight at the ground in front of the tower's base, at the mud that had collected there in a shallow depression, churned and softened by the day's rain. There was a footprint in the mud, just one. I moved closer, angling my flashlight to get a better look. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the impression in sharp relief. The print was deep and clear, pressed into the soft earth with considerable force. A boot print, by the look of it, size 11 or 12. The treads were distinctly visible, ridged and patterned in the way of serious hiking boots, the kind with thick soles meant for rough terrain. But there was only one, not a trail of prints leading to or from the tower. Not even a pair, just a single impression, stamped into the mud as if someone had materialized there from thin air, stood for a moment on one foot, and then vanished again. I crouched down to examine it more closely. The mud around it was undisturbed. I could see the texture of the soil, the way the rain had smoothed its surface, the absence of any other marks or disturbances. No drag marks. No signs of someone walking on their toes or heels to minimize their tracks. No indication of how someone had arrived at this spot or departed from it. Just that single, isolated impression, as clear and detailed as if it had been pressed into wet clay by a sculptor. "That's strange," Wade said. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid of disturbing the silence that surrounded us. I didn't respond. I was looking at the print, trying to make sense of it. My mind was running through possibilities, looking for explanations. Someone could have jumped from the stairs, could have landed on one foot, and then... what, flown away? Vanished into thin air? "Maybe someone jumped," I said, "from the stairs." Wade looked up at the tower. The lowest point of the staircase was at least 15 feet above the ground. A jump from there would be possible, but risky, and it didn't explain why there was only one footprint. A person jumping from that height would need to absorb the impact with both feet, or at least stumble and leave additional marks. "With one foot?" he asked. His skepticism was evident. I didn't have an answer. We circled the tower's base, moving slowly, our flashlight beams sweeping across the ground in overlapping arcs. We were looking for other signs of activity, more footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything that might explain what we were seeing. The mud extended in an irregular patch around the tower's foundation, maybe 20 feet in diameter, churned by years of foot traffic during rainy seasons. Beyond it, the ground was covered with the thick layer of pine needles that blanketed the forest floor. But there was nothing, just the muddy ground, undisturbed except for that single, impossible impression. I noticed other things as we circled, details that seemed wrong, though I couldn't quite articulate why. The way the pine needles around the mud patch seemed too orderly, too evenly distributed. The way the nearest trees stood at exactly the same distance from the tower's base, like they'd been planted rather than grown naturally. The way the darkness beyond our flashlight beams seemed to have substance, seemed to push back against the light rather than simply absorbing it. I told myself I was imagining things. Told myself the late hour and the strange silence were playing tricks on my perception. Told myself there was a rational explanation for the footprint, and we just hadn't found it yet. "Let's go up," I said. Wade nodded. We started climbing. The stairs groaned under our weight. Each step produced a different sound, a different quality of creak, as if the wood was speaking in a language we couldn't understand. The structure swayed slightly in the wind that had picked up since we'd started climbing, a gentle oscillation that made my stomach clench. I kept one hand on the railing, which wasn't much more reassuring. The wood was rough and splintered, and I could feel it flex under my grip. Halfway up, I paused to look out over the forest. From this height, I could see the canopy stretching away in all directions. A dark, undulating sea, broken only by the occasional gap where a tree had fallen or a fire had cleared a patch decades ago. No lights, no signs of civilization, just the forest, vast and indifferent, swallowing everything. The moonlight, what little of it penetrated the cloud cover, gave the treetops a silvery quality that seemed almost beautiful, almost peaceful. But the silence persisted. Even at this height, even with the wind picking up, the forest was quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was listening, that it was waiting for something. Wade passed me on the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing off the windows of the observation cabin above. I followed. The cabin door was closed, but not locked. Wade pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. We stepped inside. The space was small, maybe 12 feet square, dominated by the observation platform that ran along the windows on all four sides. There was a desk in one corner with radio equipment, the kind of older setup that had been standard issue decades ago and never updated. A cot against one wall, neatly made. A small propane heater that wasn't running. Its presence a reminder of how cold it could get up here during the winter months. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of coffee and something else, something organic that I couldn't quite identify. Something like damp cloth left too long in a closed space. "Dennis?" I called out. No response. The cabin was empty. I swept my flashlight across the space, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. The cot was made, the blanket tucked in with military precision. Dennis Kowalski was former Army, I remembered. 6 years in the infantry before he'd gotten out and started working seasonal jobs with the Forestry Service. The kind of guy who kept his space orderly, who followed procedures, who didn't miss check-ins without a damn good reason. The radio equipment sat silent on the desk, its power light dark. Someone had turned it off, not just let the batteries die, but deliberately switched it off. Next to it sat a coffee cup half full, the liquid inside long since gone cold. I touched the side of the cup with the back of my hand. Room temperature. It had been sitting there for hours at least. "Where is he?" Wade asked. I shook his head. I didn't know. We searched the cabin methodically, checking under the cot, behind the door, in the small closet where supplies were stored. The closet was orderly, canned goods and bottled water arranged in neat rows, emergency supplies still in their packaging. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing that I could see. There was no sign of Dennis Kowalski, no indication of where he might have gone or why he had stopped responding to radio calls. No evidence of struggle, no sign of panic, no hastily written note explaining an emergency departure. The cabin looked like its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. Except for the radio, except for the cold coffee, except for the single footprint in the mud below. Then Wade found the logbook. Every fire lookout keeps a logbook. It's part of the job, as fundamental as watching for smoke. A running record of observations, weather conditions, any unusual activity. The entries are usually mundane, the kind of routine documentation that no one ever reads except during audits. Temperature readings, wind speeds, notes about smoke sightings or aircraft passing overhead. The slow accumulation of data that, when added up over weeks and months and years, helped us understand the forest's patterns and predict its dangers. Wade had opened the logbook that sat on the desk next to the silent radio. He was staring at it with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, an expression that looked almost like fear. In 23 years of working with the man, through forest fires and search and rescue operations, and one incident involving a black bear that had gotten into a camper's food supplies, I had never seen Wade Barlow look frightened. Until now. "Logan," he said. "Come look at this." I walked over and looked down at the open page. The logbook was mostly blank. Page after page of empty lines, waiting to be filled with observations that had never been recorded. Dennis had been stationed at Tower 7 for 3 weeks, but there were almost no entries. Just a handful of dates with minimal notes. Weather clear. No activity. Wind from the southwest. October 2nd. No observations. October 5th. No observations. October 9th. Fog and morning. Cleared by noon. The entries were sparse, perfunctory, the bare minimum to satisfy the requirement of keeping a log. Nothing like what I would have expected from a former soldier, from someone who understood the importance of documentation, from someone who had been trained to observe and report. But on the last page with any writing, there was a single line. "Don't erase the track." The handwriting was shaky, uneven, the letters pressed deep into the paper as if written with considerable force. The pen had torn through the page in places, leaving small rips where the pressure had been too much. There was no date, no context, no explanation. Just those 4 words, stark and strange and completely without meaning. "Don't erase the track," Wade read aloud. His voice was hollow, uncertain. What track? I thought about the footprint outside. The single impression in the mud, isolated and unexplained. The track that led nowhere, that came from nowhere, that existed in defiance of any logical explanation. "Maybe he means the footprint," I said. Wade looked at me. His face was pale in the beam of my flashlight, the shadows carving deep lines around his eyes. Why would he write that? Why would he care about a footprint? I don't know. We stood there for a moment, staring at the logbook, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the tower swaying in the wind and the distant sound of the forest settling into night. I could hear my own heartbeat, faster than it should have been, and I could hear Wade's breathing, shallow and quick. "We need to search the area," I said. "He might be out there somewhere, injured, lost. He could have fallen on the stairs, hit his head, wandered off in a daze." Wade nodded, but he didn't look convinced. There was something in his eyes that I recognized, the same unease that was building in my own chest, the sense that we were missing something, that there was a pattern here we couldn't quite see. We headed back down the stairs. The forest at night is a different world. I've spent countless hours in the dark woods over the course of my career, and I've never gotten used to the way night transforms familiar terrain into something alien and threatening. Shapes that you'd recognize instantly in daylight become ambiguous, menacing. A rock becomes a crouching animal, a stump becomes a figure. The branches of trees become reaching hands, grasping at your clothes, your face, your sanity. Sounds that wouldn't register at all during the day seem amplified, significant, laden with meaning that you can't quite decipher. Your mind starts filling in the gaps, imagining threats that aren't there, creating narratives from nothing. The night is when the forest stops pretending to be something you understand. Wade and I split up to cover more ground, staying within radio contact but moving in different directions around the tower's base. I took the north side, pushing through undergrowth that grabbed at my legs and branches that seemed to reach for my face. My flashlight beam jumped from tree to tree, casting wild shadows that moved and shifted like living things. "Dennis," I called out. "Dennis Kowalski, can you hear me?" My voice fell flat against the trees, absorbed by the dense vegetation. No response, no sound of movement, just the forest, breathing slowly around me, watching with eyes I couldn't see. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, circling gradually away from the tower and then back again. The terrain was rough, broken by ravines and rock outcrops and patches of dense undergrowth that were nearly impossible to penetrate. If Dennis was out here, if he was injured or unconscious, finding him in this darkness would be almost impossible. I called his name every few minutes, pausing to listen for a response, hearing nothing but my own voice echoing off the trees. I found myself paying attention to the ground, looking for more footprints. The soil here was covered with pine needles and leaf litter, not the bare mud around the tower, so tracks would be harder to spot. But I looked anyway. Looked for any sign that someone had passed this way. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, the subtle compression of vegetation that indicates recent passage. Nothing. The forest floor looked undisturbed, untouched, as if no one had walked here in years. My radio crackled. Wade's voice slightly distorted by static. "Logan, come back to the tower." There was something in his voice, something that made me start moving immediately, faster than I should have been moving through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. I stumbled twice, caught myself on tree trunks, kept going. I acknowledged and started making my way back. The walk seemed longer than before, the terrain more confusing. Twice I had to stop and reorient myself, looking for the glow of Wade's flashlight through the trees. The forest seemed to have rearranged itself in my absence, familiar landmarks appearing in unexpected places. A distinctive rock formation that I'd passed on my way out was now on the wrong side of the trail. A fallen tree that I remembered stepping over was nowhere to be found. I told myself I was turned around. Told myself the darkness was playing tricks on me. Told myself there was nothing strange about getting disoriented in an unfamiliar forest at night. I didn't believe myself. When I finally reached the clearing at the tower's base, Wade was standing near the footprint. His flashlight pointed at the ground. His posture was rigid, tense, like a man bracing for a blow. "Look at this," he said. I walked over and looked where he was pointing. There were more footprints now. Not many, maybe half a dozen, but they hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. We'd circled the tower's base thoroughly before going up, examined every inch of the mud, and there had been only that single, isolated impression. Now there was a cluster. All single prints, spaced irregularly around the muddy depression. Some pointing toward the tower. Some pointing away. Some at odd angles, as if the person making them had been spinning, turning, moving in patterns that made no logical sense. None of them in sequence. None of them forming a coherent trail. It was as if someone had been hopping around the base of the tower, landing on one foot each time, covering ground in a pattern that defied explanation. "These weren't here before," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Thin, frightened. "I know," Wade replied. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who was working very hard to hold himself together. "I've been standing here for the past 10 minutes. I've been watching, and—" He shook his head slowly. His jaw was tight, the muscles jumping beneath the skin. "Nothing. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. I just looked away for a second, checked my radio, and when I looked back, there were more of them. That's not possible." "I know," he said again. We stood there in silence, our flashlight beams playing across the cluster of footprints. The mud was soft and wet, holding the impressions clearly. I could see the tread patterns, identical to the first print we'd found. The same boot, the same size, the same depth, suggesting roughly the same weight and force. But how? How could someone be making prints without us seeing or hearing them? We'd been right there. Wade had been standing guard. The area was open, visible, illuminated by our flashlights. "I don't like this," Wade said quietly. His voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "Something's wrong here. Something's very wrong. Neither did I." "We should go back to the truck," I said. "Radio this in, get more people out here." Wade nodded, but before we could move, something caught my attention. A glint of light in my peripheral vision, up at the top of the tower. I turned and looked. The cabin windows were lit. Not brightly. Not like someone had turned on the main lights. But there was a glow up there, faint and flickering, like candlelight or a small flashlight with dying batteries. It pulsed slightly, rhythmically, like the breathing of something very large. I felt my throat tighten. We had just been up there. We had searched every corner of that cabin, looked under the cot, checked the closet, examined every inch of that small space. There had been no one. No light source. No indication that anyone was present. And yet, the power was off, I said. My voice was barely audible. The radio was dead. There was no one up there. "There's someone up there now," Wade replied. We stood there for a long moment, our flashlights pointed at those glowing windows, watching the light pulse and flicker. It had a quality that I can only describe as organic, not the steady glow of an electric light or the random dance of a candle flame. Something more deliberate, more intentional. Like whatever was producing it was aware of us standing below. Like it was breathing for our benefit. I thought about the footprints. The way they had appeared while Wade was watching. The way they seemed to materialize from nothing. As if whatever was making them existed just outside the edge of perception. Just beyond the boundary of what our eyes could register. Maybe it had been up there the whole time. Maybe it had been standing in the corner of that cabin while we searched, invisible, silent, watching us with eyes we couldn't see. Maybe it had waited until we left before revealing itself. The thought made my skin crawl. "Wade," I said. My voice came out as a whisper. What if it was there the whole time? What if it was watching us? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I could see the same thought written on his face, the same cold realization settling into his bones. We looked at each other. The same question in both our minds. Do we go up? Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get back to the truck and drive away and never come back to this place. But Dennis was still missing. And whatever was up there, whatever was making those lights and those footprints, it might know something about what had happened to him. We went up. The ascent felt different this time, more unstable, more reluctant to support our weight. I could hear the stairs groaning beneath my boots, could feel the whole tower swaying in a wind that seemed to have grown stronger since we'd descended the first time. Each step felt like a negotiation, a bargain struck with a structure that might decide at any moment to stop honoring its agreements. Wade was ahead of me, his flashlight beam fixed on the cabin door above. The glow from the windows was still visible, that faint, flickering illumination that shouldn't have been there. It seemed to pulse slightly, rhythmically, like breathing, like something alive up there, waiting for us. I kept my hand on my sidearm. I didn't know what I expected to find up there, but I wanted to be ready for it. Ready for anything. Though what preparation could possibly be adequate for what we'd already seen, I couldn't say. Wade reached the door first. He paused, listening. I stopped on the stairs behind him, trying to quiet my breathing, trying to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. Nothing. The tower was silent except for the wind and the creaking of wood. Wade pushed the door open. The cabin was empty. The glow we'd seen from below was gone. The windows were dark again, reflecting our flashlight beams back at us, showing us only our own faces, pale and frightened, floating in the black glass. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The cot made, the radio silent, the coffee cup half full on the desk, the logbook still open to the same page. Don't erase the track. I don't understand, I said. There was a light. We both saw it. Wade didn't respond. He was walking slowly around the cabin, checking the corners, looking for anything we might have missed. His movements were deliberate, methodical, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept drifting toward his weapon. "There's no one here," he finally said. "There's no way anyone could have gotten past us on the stairs. Maybe they went out the window." I walked to the nearest window and looked out. The drop was 40 feet, straight down to the forest floor. No ladder, no rope, no way for someone to descend without killing themselves. The ground below was visible in the faint starlight, the muddy patch clear and unmarked except for those impossible footprints. "Unless they didn't touch the ground," Wade said quietly. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The footprints," he said. "They appear from nowhere. They don't connect. It's like whoever's making them can just move without walking, without crossing the space in between. They're just there, and then they're somewhere else, and there's no trace of how they got from one place to the other." "That's not possible," I said. "I know," he replied, "but neither is anything else that's happened tonight." We stood in silence for a moment. The wind gusted outside, rattling the windows, making the whole tower sway. I could hear the stairs creaking below us, the sound of wood under stress, the groaning of a structure that had stood too long against forces it was never designed to withstand. "I think we should leave," I said, "come back in daylight with more people." Wade nodded slowly. "But first, look at this." He was pointing at the logbook. I walked over and looked. The writing had changed. Where before there had been only that single line, "Don't erase the track," now there was more. Additional words, written in the same shaky handwriting, pressed deep into the paper. "Don't erase the track. The track is all that's left." I tried to follow it. Now, I'm part of it. I felt the blood drain from my face. My vision went gray at the edges, and I had to grip the desk to steady myself. "That wasn't there before," I said. "We looked at this page. That wasn't there." Wade didn't say anything. He was staring at the logbook with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear, exactly. Something more like resignation. Like acceptance of something he'd been refusing to believe. "We need to go," I said. "Now." We went. The descent down the stairs felt like it took forever. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, with the swaying of the tower, with the darkness that pressed in from all sides. I kept my flashlight pointed at my feet, watching where I stepped, trying not to think about what we'd seen in the cabin, about the words that had appeared in the logbook as if written by an invisible hand. When we reached the bottom, I almost didn't want to look at the mud, but I looked. The footprints were gone, all of them. The single isolated print we'd found when we first arrived, the cluster that had appeared while Wade was watching, the irregular pattern that had made no sense, that had seemed to suggest movement without motion, presence without passage. Gone. As if they'd never existed. The mud was smooth and undisturbed, marked only by our own boot prints where we'd walked around the tower's base. Whatever had left those impressions, whatever had created that impossible pattern, had erased itself, had taken back the evidence of its presence. "They're gone," Wade said. His voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and hollow. "I know. How, I don't know." We stood there in the darkness, our flashlight beams moving across the empty mud, looking for any trace of what had been there just 30 minutes before. But there was nothing. No sign that we hadn't imagined the whole thing. Except we hadn't imagined it. We'd both seen it, we'd both documented it in our minds, even if we hadn't thought to photograph it. We'd examined those footprints, studied their details, tried to make sense of their impossible arrangement. And now they were gone. "The logbook," I said. "We need to take the logbook." Wade nodded. Evidence. Proof that something had happened here, even if we couldn't explain what. I started back toward the stairs, but Wade grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said. "Listen." I stopped, listened. At first I heard nothing, just the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl finally breaking the silence, the normal sounds of the forest at night. But then, underneath those familiar noises, I heard something else. Footsteps, not on the ground, above us, on the tower's stairs. Someone was coming down. We backed away from the tower's base, our flashlights trained on the staircase. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one producing a distinct creak from the aging wood. Step, pause, step, pause, step. Like someone descending carefully, taking their time, making sure of each placement. But we couldn't see anyone. Our flashlight beams illuminated the entire staircase, from the ground all the way up to the cabin. Every step was visible. Every landing, every railing, every inch of weathered wood. And there was no one there. The footsteps continued. Step. Pause. Step. I could hear them clearly now, could pinpoint their location on the staircase. They were about halfway down, moving toward us. But there was nothing to see, nothing but empty stairs and darkness. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The forest went still around us, every sound suspended, every movement frozen. And then, in the mud at the base of the tower, a footprint appeared. I saw it happen. I watched it form, the mud pressing down as if under the weight of an invisible boot, the treads appearing line by line in the soft earth. It was exactly like the prints we'd seen before. Same size, same pattern, same depth, but there was no one there to make it. Wade made a sound beside me, something between a gasp and a moan, a sound I'd never heard a grown man make before. I couldn't take my eyes off the print, off the mud that was still settling around its edges, off the impossible thing I was watching happen. Another print appeared, then another. They were moving toward us now. Those invisible footsteps, crossing the muddy ground in a direct line from the tower's base to where we stood. Run, Wade said. We ran. I don't remember much about the run back to the truck. Just fragments. The branches tearing at my clothes. The sound of Wade crashing through the undergrowth behind me. The burn in my lungs and the pounding of my heart. The darkness that seemed to press in from all sides, trying to swallow us, trying to keep us from escaping. I fell once. My foot caught on a root or a rock, I'll never know which, and I went down hard, my flashlight flying from my hand, my palms and knees slamming into the forest floor. The pain was sharp, immediate, grounding. It reminded me that I was still real, still physical, still subject to the normal laws of cause and effect. Wade hauled me up without breaking stride. His grip on my arm was like iron. We kept running. The trail seemed longer on the way back. The descent that should have taken 15 minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow held threats we couldn't name. But we kept running, kept moving, kept putting distance between ourselves and whatever was following us from the tower. We reached the truck somehow, threw ourselves inside. I started the engine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The tires spun in the mud, found traction, propelled us forward. I drove too fast, the truck bouncing and sliding on the unpaved road, headlights carving wild arcs through the darkness. Neither of us looked back. I wanted to. Some part of me needed to see if anything was following, needed to know if those invisible footsteps had pursued us down the trail. But a deeper instinct kept my eyes forward, kept my hands on the wheel, kept my foot pressed hard against the accelerator. Wade was muttering something under his breath. A prayer, maybe, or a string of curses. I couldn't tell which. His hands gripped the dashboard so hard I thought he might leave dents in the plastic. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, wide and unblinking, like a man afraid that if he closed them he might see something worse than darkness. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, the trees seeming to lean toward us, reaching for the truck with their dark branches. I kept expecting something to step out of the shadows, something tall and thin, something that walked without leaving tracks, something that had followed us from the tower and was now running alongside the truck, keeping pace, waiting for us to slow down. But nothing appeared. The road unwound ahead of us, empty and dark, and we drove through the forest like men fleeing a fire. I watched the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty. The forest stood dark and silent, revealing nothing. But I kept watching, kept expecting to see something step out of the trees, something that walked without leaving tracks, something that had no face and no form but left footprints anyway. It wasn't until we reached the paved road that I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out in a long, shuddering exhale, and beside me, Wade did the same. The tension in the cab didn't break exactly, but it shifted. We were out of the forest now. We were back in the world of streetlights and road signs and other human beings. Whatever we'd seen at Tower 7, it felt farther away now. Less immediate, less real. But it wasn't less real. I knew that even then. Whatever had happened at that tower, whatever had made those footprints and written those words and descended those stairs, it was just as real as the steering wheel in my hands. Just as real as the road beneath our tires. Just as real as the fear that still churned in my stomach like something alive. We didn't speak until we were back on paved road, heading toward the ranger station. Wade's hands were white on the dashboard, his knuckles standing out like bone. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. "What was that?" he finally asked. His voice was hoarse, ragged. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. I didn't have words for what we'd seen. Footprints appearing from nothing. Stairs creaking under invisible weight. Evidence of presence without any visible presence. "We need to report this," I said. "Report what?" Wade replied. "That we saw footprints appear by themselves? That we heard someone walking downstairs with no one there? They'll think we've lost our minds. Dennis is still missing." That gave him pause. He was quiet for a moment, staring out the windshield at the road unwinding ahead of us, at the headlights cutting through the darkness. "You're right," he finally said. "We need to report Dennis missing. But the rest of it, I don't know. I don't know how to explain the rest of it. We didn't have to. When we got back to the station and filed our report, we kept it simple." Tower 7 was unmanned. Dennis Kowalski was not present. A search of the immediate area had been inconclusive. We recommended a full search and rescue operation at first light. The questions came later, of course. Where had Dennis gone? Why had he stopped responding to radio calls? What had happened at Tower 7? We told them we didn't know, which was true. We told them we'd found the tower empty, the lookout missing. Also true. We didn't mention the footprints. Didn't mention the logbook entries that had appeared before our eyes. Didn't mention the invisible presence that had descended those stairs while we watched. Some things you don't put in official reports. Some things you can't. They searched for Dennis Kowalski for 3 days. Dogs, helicopters, grid searches covering miles of forest around Tower 7. Every resource the state could muster, every volunteer who showed up to help. They combed that forest inch by inch, looking for any sign of the missing lookout. I was part of the search teams, walking the same trails I'd run down in terror, looking for a man I suspected they were never going to find. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no equipment. No trace of human passage except for the trail we'd made during our own search. Dennis Kowalski had simply vanished, as if he'd never existed, as if he'd been erased from the world as completely as those footprints had been erased from the mud. The official conclusion was that he'd left the tower for unknown reasons and become lost in the forest. It happened sometimes. People got disoriented, made bad decisions, wandered away from safety instead of toward it. The forest was unforgiving. The terrain was treacherous. A man could fall into a ravine or get trapped in a thicket and die within shouting distance of searchers who never heard him. That's what the reports said. That's what everyone chose to believe. I didn't believe it. I went back to Tower 7 3 days after the search was called off. Alone, against regulations, against every instinct telling me to leave it alone, to move on, to forget what I'd seen. I told myself I was looking for closure. Told myself I needed to see the place in daylight to convince myself it was just an ordinary tower in an ordinary forest. I had to know. I had to understand. The tower looked different in daylight. Smaller somehow, less threatening. The wood was gray and weathered, the windows grimy, the whole structure having an air of abandonment that seemed entirely natural. This was just an old fire lookout, past its prime, slowly returning to the forest that surrounded it. The mud at the base had dried. There were no footprints, no traces of what had happened that night. Just cracked earth and dead leaves and the ordinary detritus of the forest. I climbed the stairs. They didn't creak the way they had at night. Or maybe they did, and I just didn't notice it the same way. Everything feels different in daylight. Less ominous. Less laden with meaning. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it. The cot made. The radio silent. The coffee cup still sitting on the desk. Its contents evaporated now, leaving only a dark residue at the bottom. The logbook was still there. I opened it with hands that trembled slightly despite my best efforts to control them, flipped to the last page with writing. It was blank. The words were gone. Don't erase the track. The track is all that's left. I tried to follow it. Now I'm part of it. All of it gone. The page was clean, unmarked, as if nothing had ever been written there. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The evidence was disappearing. The proof of what had happened was being erased, line by line, print by print, until nothing remained but memory. I took the logbook anyway, stuffed it into my pack and descended the stairs and walked back to my truck without looking back. I still have it. It's in a box in my closet, along with my old uniform and my badge and all the other artifacts of a career I ended 6 months after that night. The pages are still blank. Whatever was written there, whatever truth Dennis Kowalski had tried to leave behind is gone now. Erased, as if it had never existed. But I remember. Wade and I never talked about it again. Not directly. We worked together for a few more months after that night. But there was a distance between us now, a space that neither of us knew how to bridge. We'd shared something that couldn't be explained, couldn't be processed, couldn't be integrated into any normal understanding of how the world worked. We still did our jobs, still patrolled the forests, still responded to calls, still performed the duties we'd sworn to perform. But something had changed. We looked at the trees differently now. Listened to the silence differently, watched for footprints that shouldn't be there. He retired 6 months before I did. Moved to Florida, I heard, bought a house near the beach, as far from forests as he could get. We exchanged a few emails in the years after, but they were superficial, careful, never touching on the thing that bound us together and kept us apart. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened at Tower 7, trying to make sense of it, trying to find an explanation that fits within the boundaries of the rational world. The best I've come up with isn't really an explanation at all. It's more of a theory, a way of thinking about it that doesn't make it any less strange but at least gives it a framework. I think Dennis Kowalski found something out there. Or something found him. Some phenomenon that exists in those deep woods, some force or presence or pattern that we don't have names for and can't understand. He tried to document it. Don't erase the track. He was trying to preserve evidence, to leave a record, to make sure that whatever he'd discovered wouldn't be lost. But it didn't work. The evidence erased itself. The footprints disappeared. The logbook entries vanished. Whatever exists out there, it doesn't want to be documented. It doesn't want to be known. The track is all that's left. I tried to follow it. Now I'm part of it. Those words haunt me. They suggest that Dennis didn't just disappear. He became something else. He joined whatever was making those footprints, whatever was descending those stairs, whatever exists in those woods beyond the reach of flashlight beams and radio signals. Is he still out there? Is he still part of that pattern, that track, that invisible presence that moves through the forest without leaving lasting traces? I don't know. I can't know. Some questions don't have answers, at least not answers that human minds can comprehend. But I remember what it felt like, standing at the base of that tower, watching footprints appear in the mud from nothing. I remember the absolute certainty that something was there, something real and present and utterly beyond my understanding. And I remember the words on that logbook page. The warning that came too late for Dennis, but maybe not too late for whoever reads this story. Don't erase the track, because the track might be all that's left. And once it's gone, once the evidence has been erased, there's nothing to prove that any of it ever happened. Nothing except the memory of two rangers who saw something impossible and ran from it and have spent every day since trying to forget. Some days, I almost succeed. I've gone back to the forest since then. Not to Tower 7, I can't bring myself to climb those stairs again, but to other parts of Konaku, other trails and fire roads and remote corners where the trees grow thick and the silence presses in. I don't know what I'm looking for. Maybe I'm just trying to convince myself that it was a normal forest, that what happened at Tower 7 was an anomaly, an exception, a glitch in the fabric of reality that has since corrected itself. Most of the time, the forest seems normal. The birds sing. The squirrels chatter. The undergrowth rustles with the movement of small animals. All the sounds and sights and smells that should be there, doing their part to maintain the illusion of an ordered, comprehensible world. But sometimes, in certain places, at certain times, I feel something else. A presence. A pattern. Something moving through the trees just beyond the range of sight, just outside the reach of hearing. Something that leaves no tracks, no traces, no evidence of its passage. Something that exists in the spaces between moments, in the gaps between perceptions, in the blind spots that we never notice because our minds fill them in with assumptions. I think it's always been there. I think it's been part of the forest for longer than humans have been walking its trails. We just don't see it because we're not looking. We don't hear it because we've forgotten how to listen. We walk right past it every day, never knowing, never suspecting, until someone stops, until someone pays attention, until someone writes in a logbook, "Don't erase the track." Then the pattern shifts. Then the presence makes itself known. Then things happen that can't be explained, that can't be documented, that can't be remembered properly because memory itself becomes unreliable. Dennis Kowalski saw something. He tried to record it, to preserve it, to leave a message for whoever came after him. But the forest erased his words. The forest erased his footprints. The forest erased him in the end, absorbed him into whatever it is that moves through those trees in the dark. Now I'm part of it, he wrote. Maybe that's not as terrible as it sounds. Maybe becoming part of that pattern, that track, that invisible presence is just another form of existence. A transformation rather than an ending. A joining rather than a disappearing. Or maybe it's exactly as terrible as it sounds. Maybe Dennis Kowalski is still aware, still conscious, still trapped in something that has no mouth to scream and no hand to write, and no way to communicate with the world he left behind. I don't know. I'll never know. All I know is what I saw that night. Footprints appearing from nothing, stairs creaking under invisible weight, words appearing in a logbook and then vanishing again, erased by a force that doesn't want to be understood. The track is all that's left, and I didn't erase it. I couldn't. It erased itself, taking with it any proof that I'm not just a retired ranger with a story that sounds like a campfire tale, a nightmare dressed up as a report. But I know what I saw. Wade knows what he saw. And somewhere out there, in the deep woods of the Conacook National Forest, something is still moving, still making footprints that appear and disappear, still climbing and descending stairs that creak under its invisible weight, still waiting for the next person to stop, to pay attention, to write in a logbook. Don't erase the track, because once you see it, once you acknowledge it, you become part of the pattern too. Part of the track that winds through the forest, connecting all the lost souls who stopped too long, who looked too close, who tried to understand something that exists beyond understanding. That's my warning. Take it for what it's worth. And if you ever find yourself at the base of an old fire tower, staring at a single footprint in the mud, a footprint that shouldn't be there, that couldn't be there, walk away. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't try to follow. I am Ben Tucker Lane, and I spent most of the past 8 years working as a forest ranger in Conacook National Forest in southern Alabama. The incident I will recount took place toward the end of my 6th year there, in October, when the humidity clung to your body like damp clothing. Yet the nights began to carry the first hints of autumn breezes. I've heard many such stories. Park rangers share moments that make them question what they know about the forest, things they can't explain. Most of the time, I listen, nodding my head because I recognize pieces of my own experiences. The loneliness, the way sounds behave differently there, the feeling of being watched by something you can never quite pinpoint. But this story is different. At least it feels different to me. Because what happened on the Conacook Trail that October wasn't about what I saw. It was about what stopped making sense. It was about distance and direction and the fundamental trust we place in our own perception of space. It was about walking forward and ending up behind, about collecting evidence that refused to stay collected, about time folding in on itself like wet paper until I couldn't tell the difference between memory and prophecy. I need you to understand something before I begin. I know these woods. I've walked every marked trail and most of the unmarked ones. I've tracked poachers through the longleaf pines at 3 a.m, followed blood trails through palmetto thickets, sat in observation blinds for 12 hours, waiting for illegal hunters to reveal themselves. I've found lost hikers, recovered bodies, and spent more nights alone in that forest than I can count. I've learned to read the land the way other people read books, to sense changes in terrain and atmosphere the way a sailor senses changes in the wind. I'm not someone who gets turned around. That's what makes this so hard to talk about. The Conacook National Forest covers roughly 84,000 acres of southern Alabama, stretching from the Florida border up toward Montgomery in a patchwork of longleaf pine savannas, cypress swamps, and hardwood bottomlands. It's not a famous park. You won't find it on postcards or in travel magazines. Most people outside Alabama have never heard of it, and even locals tend to pass it by on their way to the beaches of the Gulf Coast. But for those who know it, Conacook is special. It's one of the last remaining examples of the longleaf pine ecosystem that once covered 90 million acres of the American South. The trees here are tall and straight, their bark armored in thick plates, their canopies open to let sunlight reach the wiregrass below. In the spring, the forest floor explodes with wildflowers. In the fall, the pitcher plants bloom purple and strange in the boggy lowlands. It's a quiet place, a patient place, and I loved it in the way you love something that asks nothing of you but your presence. I was sitting in my truck at the Blue Spring Recreation Area on a Monday morning when the call came in. Missing hiker, solo backpacker who'd failed to return from a 2-night trip. Standard stuff, the kind of thing we dealt with maybe half a dozen times a season. Most of the time it ended with a sheepish middle-aged man explaining how he'd lost track of the days, or a sprained ankle that had slowed someone's pace, or an unexpected case of stomach trouble that had kept someone close to their campsite longer than planned. The hiker's name was David Moreau. 43 years old, from Mobile, worked in insurance or accounting or something equally forgettable. He'd checked in at the visitor center on Thursday morning, told the volunteer at the desk he was planning to hike the Eastern Loop, camp at 2 designated backcountry sites, and return Saturday afternoon. Standard trip, well within his stated experience level. When he hadn't appeared by Sunday morning, the volunteer on duty called it in. We tried his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. His emergency contact, a sister in Pensacola, said she hadn't heard from him since Wednesday night. His car, a silver Honda Accord with a Life is Good bumper sticker, sat alone in the parking lot coated in a fine layer of yellow pine pollen. By Monday morning, with still no sign of Moreau, we initiated a formal search. The team was small. That's the reality of working in an underfunded park during an era of endless budget cuts. Our full-time ranger staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, and most of them were spread across the forest's vast acreage, handling their own responsibilities. For this search, I had myself, a junior ranger named Pete Holloway, who'd been with us less than a year, and a volunteer from the county search and rescue team. Her name was Elise Jameson. I remember the first time I saw her that morning, standing by the trailhead with her pack already on, studying the map board with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was actually absorbing the information rather than just looking at it. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of calm, centered expression that immediately put me at ease. Most volunteers show up nervous, chatty, eager to prove themselves. They pepper you with questions, second-guess their own decisions, look to you for constant validation. It's exhausting, and it slows everything down. Elise just seemed ready, like she'd already done the mental preparation, already worked through whatever anxieties she might have had, and was now simply waiting to begin. She'd been through the county's SAR training program and had participated in a few searches before, I learned. But nothing like this. Nothing in terrain this dense, this disorienting. The Eastern Loop wound through some of the most remote sections of the forest, places where the trail markers grew sparse and the undergrowth pressed in from all sides. It was easy to get turned around out there, even if you knew what you were doing. I made a mental note to keep her close. We divided the search area into grids and assigned sectors. Pete would take the northern section near Blue Spring Creek, where Moreau might have wandered if he'd gotten confused about directions. Elise and I would cover the Eastern Loop itself, following the route Moreau had planned to hike, looking for any sign of his passage. We synchronized our radios, confirmed our GPS waypoints, and agreed to check in every 30 minutes. Standard protocol, the kind of careful procedure that works 99 times out of 100. The morning was gray and still. Low clouds sat heavy on the treetops, threatening rain that never quite arrived. No wind. The longleaf pines stood motionless, their needles forming a thick carpet that muffled our footsteps. I've always found the Conecuh Forest beautiful in an understated way. It doesn't have the dramatic vistas of the Rockies or the ancient majesty of the redwoods. It's quieter than that, more patient. The kind of place that doesn't demand your attention but slowly, steadily claims it anyway. The kind of place that keeps its secrets until it's ready to share them. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when I noticed the first odd thing. It was small, easy to dismiss. I had my GPS unit out, tracking our progress along the trail, and I glanced down to check our position. According to the device, we'd covered about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. That felt right. That matched the rhythm of our pace and the landmarks I'd been noting along the way. A distinctive bend in the trail, a fallen pine with shelf fungus climbing its trunk, a low, boggy section where we'd had to step carefully across exposed roots. But when I looked again 10 minutes later, the GPS showed we'd only traveled 2.25 miles. I stopped walking, checked the display, tapped it with my finger like that might reset whatever glitch was causing the discrepancy. The number stayed the same. 2.25 miles, a 1/4 mile less than it had shown before. Elise noticed me standing there and doubled back. She didn't ask what was wrong right away, just stood beside me, waiting, reading my body language the way a good search partner learns to do. I told her the GPS was acting up. Probably just a satellite issue, I said. The tree canopy could interfere with the signal sometimes. It happened. Nothing to worry about. She nodded, accepting the explanation. Why wouldn't she? It made sense. It was the reasonable thing to believe. We kept walking. The trail wound through a section of forest where the pines grew especially thick, their trunks rising like columns in some vast natural cathedral. The understory was sparse here, just wiregrass and the occasional palmetto, which meant good visibility in most directions. If Moreau had wandered off the trail, we should have been able to spot signs of his passage. Broken branches, disturbed ground, scuffed pine straw. Something, but there was nothing. The forest looked untouched, undisturbed in a way that felt almost deliberate, like a room that had been carefully cleaned before our arrival. I called out Moreau's name. My voice fell flat against the trees, absorbed by the thick carpet of needles, and no answer came back. Just silence, just the soft crunch of our footsteps, and the distant cry of a crow somewhere to the south. I checked the GPS again, 2 miles from the trailhead. The cold feeling started in my stomach and spread slowly upward. That couldn't be right. We'd been walking for nearly 2 hours at that point. Even at a slow search pace, accounting for stops and careful observation, we should have covered at least 3 miles, probably closer to 4. I didn't say anything to Elise, not yet. I just marked our location mentally, noted the landmarks around us, and kept moving. The radio crackled. Pete checking in from the northern sector. His voice was clear, professional, underconcerned. Nothing to report, no sign of the missing hiker. The creek banks were clear. The old campsite at Mossy Pond was empty. He was continuing his sweep and would check back in 30. I responded in kind, keeping my voice level, not mentioning the GPS anomaly. What would I even say? Hey, Pete, I think our equipment is broken, and also possibly the fundamental nature of distance itself. He'd think I was joking, or losing my mind, or both. We stopped for water near a fallen pine that I recognized from previous hikes. I'd passed this tree dozens of times over the years. It had been struck by lightning maybe 5 or 6 seasons back. Split right down the middle, the wood inside still charred and blackened. Now it lay across a small ravine like a natural bridge, its exposed root system clawing at the air on one side, its crown slowly rotting into the earth on the other. I used to call it the gateway in my head, because passing it always felt like crossing a threshold, moving from the accessible parts of the forest into something deeper, wilder, less touched by human traffic. On the other side of the gateway, the trail grew narrower, the undergrowth thicker, the sense of isolation more complete. I knew exactly how far the gateway was from the trailhead, 4.7 miles. I'd clocked it multiple times on training runs, on patrol hikes, on idle afternoons when I had nothing better to do than measure the forest in footsteps. I looked at my GPS. 1.8 miles. That wasn't possible. That wasn't a glitch or a satellite error or interference from the canopy. That was something else entirely. That was wrong in a way I couldn't rationalize, couldn't explain away, couldn't pretend not to notice. Elise was sitting on the fallen trunk, drinking from her water bottle, and I watched her for a moment without speaking. She looked tired but not concerned. Her eyes moved across the surrounding forest with the casual awareness of someone who's spent time outdoors but doesn't yet know how strange the outdoors can become. Why would she be concerned? She didn't know the trail. She didn't know how far we'd actually walked. To her, everything probably seemed normal. I considered telling her, opening my mouth and explaining that according to every sense I possessed, every landmark I recognized, every ache in my legs and measure of sweat on my skin, we had walked nearly 5 miles through this forest. And yet my GPS, the device designed specifically to track such things, insisted we'd barely covered 2. But I didn't tell her, because saying it out loud would make it real, and I wasn't ready for it to be real. I told myself the GPS was malfunctioning. Told myself I'd get it checked when we got back to the station. Told myself to focus on the search, on Moreau, on the job I was there to do. We finished our water and kept moving. That's when I found the first item. It was a water bottle, bright blue with a black cap, lying in the middle of the trail about 30 yards ahead. Not discarded carelessly in the brush, not kicked aside by a passing hiker, not dropped and forgotten. Placed, positioned, centered on the packed earth like someone had set it down deliberately, with care, with intention. I approached it slowly, that cold feeling in my stomach spreading up into my chest. I photographed it before touching it, documenting its position the way I'd been trained, then picked it up and examined it. The brand was generic, the kind you'd buy at any sporting goods store for $6 or $7. It was about half full, the water inside slightly cloudy like it had been sitting for a while. No identifying marks or labels. Elise came up beside me. She'd seen me photograph it and understood the protocol. Evidence of the missing hiker, she said. Her voice was calm, professional. That's a good sign, right? It means he came this way. I nodded, but something about the placement bothered me. Hikers drop things accidentally all the time. They fall out of pockets, slip out of side pouches, get left behind at rest stops. But they don't usually end up standing upright in the dead center of the trail. They don't usually look like they've been arranged. I bagged the bottle, and we continued. A quarter mile later, we found a sock. Again, it was lying in the middle of the trail. A single wool hiking sock, gray with a red stripe at the top, arranged almost neatly against the packed earth. No sign of its partner. No indication of how it had gotten there or why anyone would remove a single sock while hiking through the forest. A sock, Elise said. Her voice had changed slightly. Still calm, but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify. Confusion, maybe? Or the beginning of unease. Who loses one sock? I didn't answer. I photographed it, bagged it, and checked the GPS. The display read 1.6 miles from the trailhead. We had just walked backward. I stared at the screen, tapped it again. Cycled through the menu options, looking for some setting I might have accidentally changed, some explanation that would make the numbers make sense. The number didn't change. According to this device, we were now closer to where we'd started than we'd been an hour ago, despite walking continuously in one direction. Despite never once turning around. Despite every physical sensation in my body telling me we'd been moving forward. I looked up at the trees, at the trail ahead and behind, at the gray sky visible through gaps in the canopy. Everything looked normal. The pines stood tall and straight. The wiregrass rippled slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. A mockingbird called from somewhere to my left, its song loud and complicated in the stillness. Everything looked exactly as it should. There were no unusual sounds, no strange sights, nothing to suggest that the fabric of reality had quietly torn itself apart around us. But the numbers didn't lie. Or rather, they did lie. They lied in a way that made my head hurt if I thought about it too hard. Tucker? Elise was watching me now. Her dark eyes searched my face with an intensity that suggested she'd picked up on my unease. Are you okay? I told her I was fine. I told her the GPS was definitely malfunctioning and that we'd have to navigate by landmarks from here on out. She accepted this. She didn't have any reason not to. She trusted me. I was the experienced ranger. I was the one who knew the forest. I didn't deserve that trust. Not anymore. We kept walking. Over the next hour, we found more items. A granola bar wrapper, neatly folded and placed on a flat rock at the edge of the trail. An empty Ziploc bag that had once contained trail mix, positioned upright against the base of a pine. A single hiking glove, right-handed, laid out as if waiting for someone to pick it up. A baseball cap with a faded logo I didn't recognize, sitting crown down in the exact center of the path. All of them were arranged the same way, centered on the trail, placed rather than dropped. A breadcrumb path of belongings leading us deeper into the forest. Or not deeper. I had no idea anymore how deep we were. The GPS had become useless, cycling between distances that made no logical sense. 1.3 miles, 2.7 miles, 0.8 miles, 4.1 miles. The numbers jumped and stuttered like a broken odometer, like a machine that had forgotten how to measure, like distance itself had become a fluid thing subject to rules I didn't understand. I stopped checking it. I couldn't stand looking at it anymore. The forest had changed around us. I hadn't noticed it happening, but at some point the longleaf pines had given way to a denser growth of loblolly and sweet gum. The understory had thickened too, palmetto fronds pressing in from both sides of the trail until we were walking through a narrow green corridor that seemed to close behind us as we passed. I didn't recognize this section of forest. That was impossible. I'd worked here for 6 years. I knew every trail, every landmark, every subtle variation in the terrain. I knew where the ground went boggy in the rainy season, where the old-growth pines gave way to second growth, where the deer trails intersected the human paths. I knew this forest the way I knew the layout of my own home. But nothing around me looked familiar. It was as if we'd crossed into some other forest entirely, one that shared the same trees and the same gray sky but followed different rules. Elise had noticed the change too. She'd grown quieter over the last hour, her eyes scanning the surroundings with an alertness that hadn't been there before. Her shoulders had tightened. Her steps had grown more careful. She didn't say anything about it, but she knew something was wrong. You don't need a malfunctioning GPS to sense when you're lost. You feel it in your bones, in the way the familiar becomes strange, in the way the comfortable becomes threatening. And we were lost. I knew it with a certainty that sat like a stone in my gut. Despite following the trail, despite never once deviating from the marked path, we had somehow wandered into a part of the Konaku forest I had never seen before. The radio crackled. Pete's voice, distant and distorted by static. I caught fragments of words but couldn't make out the message. Something about the creek. Something about finding. Something that might have been my name. I tried to respond, pressing the transmit button and speaking clearly into the receiver. Pete, this is Tucker. Repeat your last, I didn't copy. There was no indication that he heard me. Just more static, rising and falling like breath, like the forest itself was exhaling into the radio waves. I tried again. Pete, this is Tucker. Do you copy? Respond. Static. I looked at my watch. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. We'd been walking for almost 6 hours. By my estimation, based on the landmarks I'd recognized before they stopped being recognizable, we should have been approaching the eastern boundary of the park, maybe even crossing into private land. But there was no sign of the boundary markers, no indication that we were anywhere near the edge of the forest. Just more trees, more trail, more of the endless green corridor that seemed to have no beginning and no end. We should head back, Elise said. Her voice was steady but tight, controlled in a way that suggested she was working to keep it that way. We've been out here long enough and we're not finding anything useful. We can pick up the search tomorrow with more people. She was right. Standard protocol for a search like this was to avoid overextending, to pace ourselves and preserve our energy for the days ahead. Moreau had already been missing for 4 days. Another night wasn't going to make a significant difference in the outcome. And if we pushed too hard, if we exhausted ourselves or got injured, we'd become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. I agreed. We would turn around, follow the trail back to the trailhead, and regroup in the morning. We turned around. The problem became apparent almost immediately. The trail behind us looked different. That's the only way I can describe it. The same path we'd just walked, the same packed earth and pine straw and overhanging branches, but arranged differently somehow. Like someone had shuffled the elements around while our backs were turned. Like the forest had been disassembled and reassembled in a slightly wrong order. Elise noticed it too. She stopped after maybe 50 yards, looking around with an expression that mirrored my own confusion. "Didn't we pass a big dead oak back there?" she asked. "With the hollow trunk?" I remembered the tree she was talking about. We'd passed it maybe 20 minutes earlier, or what felt like 20 minutes. A massive, dead oak with a cavity in its base large enough to shelter a crouching person. I'd made a mental note of it as a potential spot to check for Moreau, somewhere a lost hiker might have taken refuge from rain or sun. But there was no oak behind us now, no hollow trunk, no dead branches reaching up like skeletal fingers, just more pine and sweet gum, indistinguishable from every other section of forest we'd walked through. "Maybe we just haven't gotten to it yet," I said. "Maybe it's farther back than we thought." Elise didn't respond, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. The words felt hollow in my mouth, a desperate attempt to impose logic on something that had left logic behind. We kept walking. The items continued to appear, but now they were in different positions than we'd found them before. The baseball cap that had been lying on the trail was now hanging from a low branch, suspended by its adjustable strap as if someone had carefully placed it there. The hiking glove was wedged between 2 rocks instead of sitting in the open. The sock had moved from the center of the path to its edge, half hidden beneath a palmetto frond. I photographed each one again, documenting the changes, trying to maintain some grip on procedure even as a procedure stopped making any kind of sense. Elise watched me do it but didn't comment. There was nothing to say. We were both thinking the same thing, both wrestling with the same impossible conclusion. Something was moving these things. Something was rearranging the evidence. Something was watching us and responding to our presence in ways we couldn't understand. The radio stayed silent. I tried Pete 3 more times and got only static in response. Either something was wrong with the equipment, or we had moved so far outside our normal range that the signal couldn't reach us. Neither explanation was comforting. At some point, I became aware of the silence, not the absence of human noise, though that was there too. This was a deeper silence, a more complete one. The forest had gone quiet around us in a way I'd never experienced before. in a way I hadn't thought possible in a healthy ecosystem. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, no squirrels chattering in the branches, no woodpeckers drumming on distant trees, no frog songs from the low, wet places. Nothing. Just our footsteps, and our breathing, and the soft, oppressive weight of absolute quiet. I'd been in quiet forests before. Early mornings in winter when the cold kept everything still. The hushed moment before a storm when the barometric pressure dropped and the animals went to ground. But this was different. This wasn't natural stillness. This was absence. This was the sound of every living thing holding its breath at once. "Do you hear that?" Elise asked. I told her I did, and then, because the honesty felt necessary, "I hear that we're not hearing anything." She nodded. Her face had gone pale beneath her tan, and I noticed her hand had drifted to the strap of her pack, gripping it tightly. "What does that mean?" I told her I didn't know. "Animals go quiet for predators," I said. "Bears, cougars, things that make them nervous." "But there are no bears in Conaca," she said. "Are there? There weren't supposed to be." The forest was home to deer and turkeys, and the occasional coyote, but nothing large enough to command this kind of stillness. No apex predators. No animals that would cause every bird within earshot to fall silent. Unless they'd gone silent for something else. Something I didn't have a name for. Something that existed outside the categories I'd learned, the taxonomies I'd been trained in. We walked faster after that. Not running, not yet, but moving with an urgency we hadn't felt before. The trail seemed to stretch ahead of us without end, each bend revealing another identical stretch of forest, each rise followed by another gentle descent. The landmarks I should have recognized never appeared. The trailhead stayed impossibly, unreachably distant. And then I saw the water bottle. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, upright and centered, exactly as it had been when I'd found it hours earlier. The same bright blue plastic, the same black cap, the same half-full slosh of liquid when I picked it up and turned it in my hands. But that was impossible. I'd collected this bottle. I'd bagged it as evidence. It was in my pack right now, sealed in a plastic evidence bag with my initials and the time of collection written on the label. I set my pack down and opened it. Dug through the contents until I found the evidence bag. Held it up so Elise could see. The bag was empty, not torn open or tampered with, not unzipped or damaged in any way, just empty, as if the bottle I'd collected had simply ceased to exist inside it, as if it had never been there at all. I looked at the bottle in my other hand, then at the empty bag, then at Elise, whose expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to fear. "Tucker," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" I wish I had an answer. I wish I could give you some rational explanation for what happened next, some logical framework that makes sense of the senseless. But I can't. All I can do is tell you what I experienced and let you decide what to make of it. I put the bottle back in the evidence bag, sealed it shut, watched through the plastic as it sat there, solid and real and undeniably present, felt its weight in my hand. We kept walking. 10 minutes later, I found the sock again. Same gray wool, same red stripe, same centered position on the trail. I didn't even check the evidence bag this time. I knew what I would find. The bag would be empty. The sock would have returned to its original position. Whatever force was at work here, it wasn't interested in letting me collect evidence. It wasn't interested in letting me bring anything back. Elise had stopped talking. She walked beside me in silence, her eyes fixed ahead, her breathing shallow and quick I didn't try to comfort her. I didn't have any comfort to offer. The words that might have helped, "We're going to be fine. There's a logical explanation, we just need to stay calm," felt like lies, and I couldn't bring myself to speak them. The trail began to look familiar again, but in a way that brought no relief. I started recognizing sections we'd already walked. A distinctive bend where the path curved around a massive pine, its trunk scarred by lightning. A boggy stretch where we'd had to pick our way across exposed roots. A clearing where a shaft of gray light penetrated the canopy and illuminated a circle of wiregrass. We were walking in circles. Despite moving in a straight line, never deviating, never turning around, we were somehow covering the same ground over and over. I checked my GPS one more time, though I knew it wouldn't help. The screen showed our position as a single, blinking dot that refused to move. No trail of breadcrumbs marking where we'd been, no indication of which direction led home, just that one fixed point, pulsing steadily, going nowhere. I looked at my watch. It was after 5 o'clock. We'd been walking for nearly 8 hours. The light was starting to fade, the gray sky dimming toward a darker gray that would soon become night. "We should stop," I said. "Make camp. Try again in the morning." Elise looked at me like I'd suggested we lay down and die. "We can't stop," she said. Her voice had an edge to it now, a brittleness that suggested she was barely holding herself together. "We have to keep moving. We have to get out." I understood her panic. I felt it too, pressing against my chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. But I also knew that walking through unfamiliar forest in the dark was a recipe for disaster. Twisted ankles, falls, getting even more hopelessly turned around than we already were. "If we keep walking, we'll hurt ourselves," I said. "Or worse, we have shelter, we have water, we have food. The best thing we can do right now is rest and get our bearings when the light comes back." She didn't argue. Maybe she saw the logic, or maybe she was just too exhausted to fight. We found a small clearing off the trail where the ground was relatively dry and the trees provided some shelter from the elements. I set up a simple camp while Elise sat with her back against a pine trunk, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around her knees like she was trying to hold herself together. I tried the radio again as darkness fell. Static. Just endless static. Like the voice of the forest itself whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Elise. We sat in our separate silences, listening to the profound absence of sound that surrounded us, waiting for something we couldn't name. The silence never broke. Nothing moved in the darkness beyond our small circle of camp. The fire I'd built, more for comfort than warmth, crackled softly, the only sound in a world that had forgotten how to make noise. Shadows danced at the edge of the firelight, shapes that might have been trees, or might have been something else, something watching, something waiting. I felt it out there. Whatever it was that had swallowed the birds and the insects and the small rustling creatures. Whatever it was that had bent the trail back on itself and stolen objects from sealed bags. Whatever it was that had turned the familiar forest into a maze with no exit. It was watching us. I don't know how I knew that, I just knew. The way you know when someone's standing behind you in an empty room. The way you know when you're not alone, even when every sense tells you that you should be. We were not alone in that forest. Morning came slowly. The gray sky lightened by degrees until I could see the trees around us clearly again. The silence persisted, that awful vacuum of natural sound. But in the growing light it felt slightly less oppressive, less threatening, less immediate. We ate a quick breakfast from our packs and prepared to move out. I had a plan, or something like one. We would ignore the trail entirely and navigate by compass, heading due west until we hit the road that bordered the forest. It was maybe 7 or 8 miles at most. Even if we moved slowly, even if the forest threw every obstacle it had at us, we should be able to cover that distance in a few hours. The compass pointed west. We started walking. An hour later, according to my watch, we were still walking. The terrain looked the same. The trees looked the same. The undergrowth pressed in just as thickly as before, requiring us to push through rather than walk around. No sign of the road, no indication that we were making any progress at all. 2 hours. 3. The forest didn't change. The compass still pointed west, but west never seemed to arrive. At noon, we stopped to rest. Elise hadn't spoken all morning. She drank water mechanically, ate a protein bar without tasting it, stared at the surrounding trees with the hollow expression of someone who has stopped expecting anything to make sense. I checked my pack to take inventory of our remaining supplies. And that's when I found it. A granola bar wrapper. The same one I'd collected from the trail the day before, sealed in an evidence bag with my handwriting on the label. But inside the bag, along with the wrapper, was something else. Another evidence bag. Smaller. Nested inside the first like a Russian doll. And inside that bag was another granola bar wrapper, identical to the first. I pulled it out, examined it. Same brand, same flavor. Same creases in the foil where it had been folded before being discarded. An exact copy. I reached back into my pack and pulled out the evidence bag containing the water bottle. Still sealed, still labeled. But now, instead of one bottle, there were 2. Identical twins of bright blue plastic nestled together inside the clear plastic bag. I counted all the evidence bags. Every item I'd collected had doubled, and in some cases, the copies had copies. The sock bag contained 4 socks. The glove bag contained 3 gloves. The baseball cap bag held 2 caps, and inside one of the caps was a smaller evidence bag containing another cap. Elise saw me laying out the evidence bags, saw the duplicates, saw the impossible multiplication of objects that should not have been able to duplicate themselves. She started laughing. It wasn't a healthy laugh. There was no humor in it, no joy, no release of tension. It was the sound of something breaking, of a mind reaching the limit of what it could accept and tipping over the edge. A brittle, fractured sound that echoed off the trees and faded into the silence. "It's in the bag," she said, between gasps of laughter. "It's in my bag, too." I watched as she opened her pack and pulled out the Ziploc bag she'd been using to store trail mix. The same bag she'd been snacking from since yesterday morning. The same bag I'd watched her zip and unzip a dozen times. Inside the Ziploc was another Ziploc. Same size, same label, same trail mix filling the interior. She opened it. Inside was another Ziploc, and another, and another. Bags within bags within bags. An infinite regression of identical containers, each one holding the same handful of nuts and dried fruit. The laughter died in her throat. She let the bags fall from her hands and pressed her palms against her eyes, shaking silently. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know how. I didn't understand what was happening any more than she did. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. I repacked the evidence bags without examining them further. Whatever was happening to the objects we were carrying, staring at it wasn't going to help. We needed to focus on getting out of the forest. Everything else could wait. We abandoned the compass and returned to the trail. It felt like surrender, but at least the trail was a known variable. Even if it looped and bent and refused to lead us home, it was something to follow. Something to give our walking a sense of purpose. The afternoon passed in a kind of trance. We walked. We found more items. We collected them without comment, knowing they would probably duplicate or vanish or rearrange themselves the moment we looked away. The forest stayed silent. The sky stayed gray. The trail continued without end. It was late afternoon when Elise suddenly stopped. "Look," she said. She was pointing at something ahead of us on the trail. At first, I couldn't see what had caught her attention. Just more packed earth, more pine straw, more of the same endless corridor we'd been walking through since yesterday. Then I saw it. A backpack. It was sitting at the edge of the trail, propped against the base of a pine tree. A large hiking pack, dark green with orange trim, the kind a serious backpacker would use for a multi-day trip. The kind David Moreau might have been carrying. We approached it slowly, carefully. The forest seemed to hold its breath around us, the silence deepening until I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. The pack was old and weathered, faded in places where the sun had bleached the fabric. One of the straps had been repaired with duct tape. Mildew had begun to creep up from the bottom where it touched the damp ground. It looked like it had been sitting there for years, slowly moldering into the forest floor. But David Moreau had only been missing for 4 days. I knelt beside the pack and opened the main compartment. Inside, I found clothing, food, a water filtration system, a paperback novel with a cracked spine. Standard hiking gear, nothing unusual, except for the evidence bags. They were stuffed in among the other items. Dozens of them. Clear plastic bags with my handwriting on the labels, filled with the objects we'd collected over the course of our search. The water bottle, the sock, the granola wrapper, the glove, all of them present. All of them labeled with my initials and timestamps. But the timestamps were wrong. The dates on the labels ranged from October 7th to October 23rd. We were on October 9th. These bags had been labeled with dates that hadn't happened yet, days that still lay in the future. Elise was reading the labels over my shoulder. Her breath caught when she saw the dates. "That's not possible," she whispered. No, it wasn't possible. Nothing about this was possible. I kept digging through the pack. At the bottom, beneath everything else, I found a journal. A small spiral-bound notebook with a cheap plastic cover, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore for $1 or $2. The pages were filled with handwriting I didn't recognize at first. Then I looked more closely. It was my handwriting. My careful, precise printing, the letters slanting slightly to the right the way they always did. But it wasn't anything I remembered writing. It wasn't anything I'd written yet. I flipped to the first entry, October 7th, first day of the search. GPS acting strange. Trail seems to loop back on itself. Found personal items belonging to missing hiker. Collected as evidence. Elise seems steady. I'm trying to stay calm. My throat tightened as I read. This wasn't David Moreau's journal. This was a record of our search. Written in the past tense, describing events we'd lived through. But written by a version of myself I hadn't become yet. I flipped forward. October 10th, third day in the forest. Supplies running low. Radio still not working. Elise becoming increasingly distressed. The silence is constant now. Even our footsteps sound muffled. Found our own evidence bags inside an abandoned pack. Date labels from the future. Can't make sense of it. Trying not to think too hard about what this means. October 12th, fifth day. We've stopped trying to escape. The trail leads everywhere and nowhere. Time doesn't work right here. Found another journal in another pack. Same handwriting as this one, same entries, word for word identical. How many times have I written these words? How many times will I write them again? October 15th. Can't remember how long we've been walking. Elise stopped talking yesterday. Or last week. The days blend together. Found the campsite again. Our campsite. But the fire pit was cold. Old. Ash scattered and weathered. Like no one had been there for months. October 18th. Saw someone on the trail today. Far ahead. They were walking the same direction we were. I called out, but they didn't respond. When we got closer, there was no one there. Just more evidence bags, more duplicates, more copies of things that shouldn't exist. October 21st. I understand now. We're not lost in the forest. The forest is lost in us. We brought something here, or it brought us, and now we can't leave because leaving would mean leaving ourselves behind. Does that make sense? Nothing makes sense anymore. October 23rd. Final entry. The journal ended there. The last page was blank except for a single sentence scrawled at the bottom in handwriting that had become shaky and uncertain. How far did we walk on the Konaku Trail? I closed the journal. My hands were trembling. Elise had backed away from the pack. She was staring at me with wide eyes, her face ashen. "Tucker," she said. "That's our search. That's us. Someone wrote about what we're doing right now." I nodded slowly. The implications were crawling through my mind like insects, too numerous and too horrifying to process all at once. Either someone had been here before us, someone who had experienced exactly what we were experiencing right now, or someone would come after us, searching for us the same way we were searching for Moreau. Or, and this was the possibility that made my stomach lurch, we had already been here, already walked this trail, already found this pack and this journal and stood in this exact spot, asking the same questions, and would do so again, and again, and again. Loops within loops, circles within circles, the trail bending back on itself until there was no beginning and no end, just an eternal present moment stretched across an infinite forest. I put the journal in my pack. I don't know why, it felt important somehow. A record of what we'd been through, even if it had been written by a version of ourselves we hadn't become yet. "Let's go," I said to Elise. She didn't move. Go where? I didn't have an answer, so I just started walking. After a moment, I heard her footsteps behind me. The forest swallowed us again. The trail stretched ahead, endless and unchanging. The silence pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. But this time, something was different. I heard sound. It was faint at first. So faint I thought I might be imagining it. A rustling in the underbrush somewhere to my left. A soft crunch of leaves, a sound of movement. I stopped walking. Elise stopped too, her hand going to my arm, her fingers gripping tight. The sound came again, closer now. Something was moving through the forest parallel to the trail, matching our pace. I couldn't see anything. The undergrowth was too thick, the shadows too deep. But I could hear it. A steady rhythm of footsteps, slightly out of sync with my own heartbeat. And then I saw them. A figure on the trail ahead of us. Maybe 100 yards away, standing still, facing in our direction. It was too far to make out details, but I could see enough. The shape of a person. A dark silhouette against the gray-green of the forest. Watching us. "Moreau?" I called out. "David Moreau?" No response. The figure didn't move. I started walking toward it. Slowly at first, then faster. Elise followed, though I could hear her ragged breathing behind me. 70 yards, 50, 30. The figure remained motionless. I could make out more detail now. A person wearing hiking clothes, a pack on their back, shoulders hunched slightly forward. The posture of someone who has been walking for a very long time. 20 yards. I could see the face now, or where the face should have been. There was nothing there, no features, no eyes or nose or mouth. Just smooth blank skin stretched across the front of a human skull. A face that had been erased. A person that had been emptied. I stopped walking. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I could only stare at that impossible emptiness, that absence where a person should have been. 10 yards. The figure turned away, started walking, moving down the trail in the same direction we'd been heading, that same unhurried pace, that same posture of endless exhaustion. "Wait," I shouted. "Stop!" It didn't stop. It kept walking, putting distance between us with every step. I ran. I don't know why. Every instinct screamed at me to go the other direction, to get as far away from that faceless thing as possible. But I ran toward it instead, some desperate need to understand driving my legs forward. I couldn't catch up. No matter how fast I ran, the figure stayed the same distance ahead. 20 yards, always 20 yards, walking at a steady pace while I sprinted until my lungs burned. And then it stepped off the trail and vanished into the forest. I crashed to a stop, gasping for breath. Elise caught up a moment later, her face flushed and terrified. "What was that?" she demanded. "Tucker, what the hell was that?" I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. I just stood there staring at the place where the figure had disappeared, trying to make sense of something that refused to be sensible. The sound of movement had stopped. The forest had returned to its oppressive silence. But something else had changed. I looked down at the trail and saw a piece of paper lying on the ground. A page torn from a spiral-bound notebook. I picked it up. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain, but unmistakably my own. "Don't follow it." That's how the loop starts. Stay on the trail, wait for morning. The search party will find you on day 7. Just stay on the trail. I read the note 3 times. Then I showed it to Elise. She read it in silence. When she looked up at me, there were tears in her eyes. "What do we do?" she asked. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. "We stay on the trail," I said. "We wait for morning. And we hope that whatever I knew when I wrote this, it's enough to get us home." We made camp that night in the same clearing we'd used before. Or maybe a different one that just looked identical. I'd given up trying to determine which parts of this forest were real and which were repetitions. I found more notes as the evening darkened, scraps of paper scattered around the campsite like fallen leaves, all of them in my handwriting, all of them containing fragments of information that didn't quite add up. The GPS lies. Trust your body. Food will last longer than you think. She doesn't remember the first 3 times. The faceless one isn't dangerous. It's a symptom, not a cause. There is a way out. It involves letting go. I collected the notes and tried to arrange them in an order that made sense, but they resisted interpretation. They were pieces of a puzzle without edges, a story without a beginning or end. Elise slept that night. I was surprised by that. I'd expected her to stay awake again, too frightened to close her eyes. But exhaustion eventually wins every battle, and sometime around midnight I heard her breathing slow and deepen into the rhythm of genuine sleep. I stayed awake, watching, listening. The silence persisted. No wind, no animals, no distant rumble of traffic from the roads that should have been within earshot. Just the absolute quiet of a world that had stopped making sounds. And then, in the smallest hours of the night, I heard something. A voice. It was faint. So faint, I had to hold my breath to hear it. Coming from somewhere in the forest. Somewhere beyond the edge of our small camp. It was saying my name. Tucker. Tucker Lane. I stood up slowly. The voice was coming from the south, I thought. Or maybe the east. Direction had lost all meaning here. Tucker. Can you hear me? Tucker, respond if you can hear me. It sounded like a radio transmission, tinny and distant, broken by static. A search party. Someone looking for us. I grabbed my radio and pressed the transmit button. "This is Tucker Lane," I said. "Ranger Tucker Lane. Do you copy? What's your position? Static, nothing but static. But the voice kept calling, Tucker. Tucker Lane, please respond. We're looking for you. We need your location. I followed the sound. I didn't think about it. I just started walking, leaving the camp, leaving Elise sleeping by the dead fire. The voice was a lifeline, a thread connecting me to the world I'd left behind. I had to find it. The forest closed around me. The darkness was absolute. No moon or stars visible through the canopy overhead. I could barely see my own feet as I walked, but I kept going, guided by the voice that kept calling my name. Tucker, we've found evidence of your campsite. We know you're out here. Just stay where you are. We're coming. The voice was getting clearer, closer. I could almost make out the individual words now, the cadence and rhythm of the speaker. And then I stepped into a clearing and saw the radio. It was lying on the ground in the center of the clearing. An old handheld radio, the same model we used at the station. Its speaker was crackling with the voice I'd been following. Tucker Lane, this is the search party. Please respond. I picked it up, pressed the transmit button. I'm here, I said. I'm right here, can you hear me? The voice stopped. For a long moment, there was only static. And then, slowly, the static shaped itself into words. We found you. The radio went dead. I stood in the darkness, holding the silent device, trying to understand what had just happened. The search party had found me, that's what the voice said. But I was alone in a clearing in the middle of a forest that refused to end. There was no search party. There was nothing but darkness and trees and the terrible weight of silence. And then I understood the notes, the journal, the evidence bags with future dates, the figure on the trail with no face. They weren't warnings, they were memories. I'd been here before, not once, not twice. I had walked this trail so many times that the forest had absorbed me, had incorporated me into its endless loop. The figure with no face was what I would become, what I had already become. The voice on the radio was my own voice, calling across time to a version of myself that didn't yet know he was trapped. How far did we walk on the Conacu Trail? The question from the journal echoed in my mind, but now I understood what it was really asking. Not how many miles, not how many hours, how many times. I sank to my knees in the clearing. The radio fell from my hands. I wanted to scream, to rage against the impossible prison that had closed around me. But what good would it do? The forest wouldn't hear. The forest didn't care. And then, in the darkness, I heard footsteps, not from the direction of camp, where Elise was sleeping. From ahead of me, coming closer. A figure emerged from the tree line. A person, two people. The first was Elise, but not the Elise I'd left at the camp. This one was thinner, haggard. Her eyes had a hollow, haunted quality that spoke of weeks or months rather than days in this forest. Her clothes were torn and filthy. Her hair hung in matted tangles around her face. The second was me. He looked old, decades older than I should have been. His ranger uniform was faded and torn, patched in places with pieces of other clothing. His hair had gone gray, and his face was lined with the kind of exhaustion that sleep can't cure. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had stopped hoping a long time ago. I stared at my older self. He stared back. "It's almost over," he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "This is the last loop. You understand that now, don't you? I didn't understand anything." I told him so. He smiled. It was a terrible smile, empty of joy, empty of warmth. "You will," he said. "That's how it works. Every time through, you understand a little more. Every time through, you let go of a little more. Until finally, there's nothing left to hold on to. And then you can leave. "What happens when I leave?" I asked. He gestured at himself, at the Elise beside him, at the dark forest surrounding us. "This ends," he said. "For you, anyway. The next one starts fresh. Doesn't remember any of it. Gets to discover it all over again." "That's not leaving," I said. "That's dying." "Maybe," he agreed. "Or maybe it's waking up. I've never been able to tell the difference." He reached into his pack and pulled out a notebook, the same spiral-bound journal I'd found in Moreau's bag. He handed it to me. "Write it down," he said. "Everything you've learned. Everything you need to remember. The next version of you will find it. Maybe he'll be the one who finally breaks the cycle. Maybe there's a way out that we haven't found yet." I took the journal, opened it to a blank page. "What do I write? Whatever you think matters." He turned away, the older Elise following at his side. "We've done our part, now it's your turn." They walked into the forest and disappeared among the trees. I sat alone in the clearing for a long time. The sky began to lighten, that slow gray transition from night to morning that I'd witnessed so many times in this place. And then I started writing. They found us on day 7. A search party from the county, reinforced by rangers from neighboring districts. They came with dogs and helicopters and all the resources that should have been mobilized from the start. Elise and I were sitting at the trailhead when they arrived. I don't know how we got there. I don't remember walking out of the forest. One moment we were in that endless corridor of pines, and the next we were on the access road. The parking lot visible ahead of us, voices calling our names. The doctor said we were dehydrated and mildly malnourished, but otherwise unharmed. They said we'd been missing for 6 days. They said they'd found David Moreau's body near the eastern boundary, dead from an apparent heart attack, probably within hours of starting his hike. They said a lot of things. None of them matched what I remembered. I tried to tell them what happened, about the GPS, the items that duplicated themselves, the figure with no face, the notes, the journal, the older version of myself walking away into the darkness. They nodded and made sympathetic sounds and wrote things down in their notebooks. Then they prescribed me medication for anxiety and referred me to a counselor who specialized in trauma. Elise transferred out of the volunteer program the following week. I ran into her once at a gas station in Andalusia, maybe 6 months later. She looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. I stayed on at Conacook for another 2 years. I don't know why. Maybe I was waiting for something. Maybe I thought the forest would give me answers if I was patient enough. But I never went back to the Eastern Trail. I never walked those loops of longleaf pine and loblolly, never approached the area where the map showed Blue Spring Recreation Area. I didn't trust what I might find there. The journal I wrote that last night in the clearing is still in my possession. I've read it hundreds of times looking for clues, looking for meaning. But the words I put down make less sense with each passing year. They read like fever dreams, like the scattered thoughts of a mind that had come unstuck from reality. How far did we walk on the Conacook Trail? I don't know. I'll never know. Distance stopped meaning anything in that forest. Time folded in on itself like wet paper. The person I was when I went in never fully came back out. I'm medically retired now. That's the official term for it. Unfit for duty due to psychological complications arising from traumatic field exposure. I spend a lot of time listening to stories like this one. Rangers sharing the things that happen to them in the wild places of the world. The things they can't explain. The things that keep them up at night. Most of them are looking for validation. Someone to tell them they're not crazy, that what they experienced was real, that the world contains mysteries we're not equipped to understand. I can't give them that validation. I can't even give it to myself. But I can tell my story. I can put it out there and let someone else carry it for a while. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do.